Chapter 28, Part 2 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois-Doyle. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward, Chapter 28, Part 2. Columbus. No Catholic Englishman was anything like so widely known in Europe. Books have been written about him in many languages, and his works translated into French, German, Dutch, Czech, Russian, Polish, Spanish, and Italian. A letter from Russia asks for his photograph for the Magazine of International Literature, as a writer whose works are well known in the Soviet Union. The Kulturbund in Vienna sends an emissary, inviting him there also, and, like Prague, the Vienna Pen Club wants him. "You have a distressing habit," Maud Royden once wrote, "of being the only person one really wants to hear on certain subjects." A visit to Rome in 1929 produced The Resurrection of Rome. Despite brilliant passages, the book is disappointing. It bears no comparison with the New Jerusalem and gives an impression of being thrown together hastily before the ideas had been thought through to their ultimate conclusions. Perhaps Rome was too big, even for Chesterton. He never loved the Renaissance as he did the Middle Ages, but he saw it not as primarily pagan, but as one more example of the immense vitality of a Catholicism which had had so many rebirths that it had buried its own past deeper than the past of paganism. He loved the fountains that threw their water everywhere, and he felt about Rome that the greatest monuments might be removed and yet the city's personality would remain, for Rome is greater than her monuments. He wanted to argue with those who cared for pagan Rome alone and who spent their time despising the oratorian stone of the papal city and gazing only on the Forum. And it never once occurs to them to remember that the old Romans were Italians, or to ask what a Forum was for. He was, as usual, constantly invited to lecture at the English College, the Scots College, the American College, the Beda. At the Holy Child Convent, he spoke to a crowded audience on Thomas More and humanism. Father Cuthbert, OSFC, thanking him, remarked on the mental resemblance between More and Chesterton, saying that he could quite well imagine them sitting together making jokes, some of them very good and some of them very bad. Chesterton and More, says Father Vincent McNabb, were both Cockneys. Gilbert's classical insight also seemed to him like the great chancellor's. Erasmus says that though More did not know much Greek, he knew what the words ought to mean. He interviewed Mussolini and found that Mussolini was interviewing him, so that he talked at some length of distributism and his own social ideal. Mussolini knew at least some of Gilbert's books. He told Cyril Clemens that he had keenly enjoyed The Man Who Was Thursday. He promised at the end of this interview that he would go away and think over what Chesterton had said. And it might have been better for the world had he kept that promise. For what had been said was an outline of the one possible alternative to the growing tyranny of governments. From his anxiety to be fair to fascism, Gilbert was often accused of being in favor of it, but both in this book and in several articles, having given the case for it, he went on to give the case against it, a much stronger case than that usually given by its opponents. The case for fascism lay in the breakdown of true democracy and the reign of the tyranny of wealth in the democratic countries. Chesterton would, he said, have been on the side of the Partito Popolare, as against the fascism that succeeded. In England and America, he would have infinitely preferred that the purgation of our plutocratic politics should have been achieved by radicals and Republicans. It was they who did not prefer it. It was not that fascism was not open to attack, but that liberalism has unfortunately lost the right to attack it. Those of us who were in Italy at that time will remember the truth of his description of the vitality and happiness that seemed to glow among the people. Giovinezza bellezza, heard everywhere, had then no hollow sound at the heart of it. Italy was radiant with hope. In Mussolini himself, Gilbert saluted a belief in the civic necessity of virtue. in the ideal that public life should be public, in human dignity, and respect for women as mothers, and piety and the honor due to the dead. Yet summing up the man and the movement, he saw it as primarily the sort of riot that is provoked by the evils of an evil government. Only in the Italy of the 20th century, the rioters have become the rulers. For although Mussolini had in many ways made his rule popular, although in his concessions to modern ideas and inventions he was rather breathlessly progressive, yet in the true sense of the word, Mussolini was a reactionary. A reactionary is one who merely reacts against something or permits that something to make him do something against it. A reactionary is one whom weariness itself has become a form of energy. Even when he is right, there is always a danger that what was really good in the previous society may be destroyed by what is good in the new one. Mussolini's reaction was against the liberalism in which, as an idea, Chesterton still believed. It was a reaction from democracy to authority, and his weakness, the fundamental weakness of fascism, was that it appeals to an appetite for authority, without very clearly giving the authority for the appetite. When I try to put the case for it in philosophical terms, there is some doubt about the ultimates of the philosophy. It seemed to Chesterton that there were only two possible fixed and orderly constitutions: hereditary monarchy or majority rule. The demand of the fascists to hold power as an intelligent and active minority was, in fact, to invite other intelligent and active minorities to dispute that rule, and then only by tyranny could anarchy be prevented. Fascism, he said in summary, has brought back order into the state, but this will not be lasting unless it has brought back order into the mind. The two things in the Roman visit that remain most prominent in Dorothy's memory are Gilbert's loss of a medal of Our Lady that he had always wore in his audience with the Holy Father. The loss of the medal seemed to distress him out of all normal proportion. He had the elevator boy looking for it on his hands and knees and gave him a huge reward for finding it. Gilbert has left no record of his papal audience, but, says Dorothy, it excited him so greatly that he did no work for 2 days before the event or 2 days after. Their second visit to America, 1930-1931, was far better enjoyed by Gilbert, and also, I think, by Frances, until she got ill, because on it they came closer to the real people of the country, especially during the period when he was lecturing at the University of Notre Dame, Indiana. They lived at a little house in South Bend, and he lectured every night, alternating a course on Victorian literature with one on the great figures of Victorian history. There were 36 lectures all told, and the average attendance at each was 500. At Notre Dame and the sister college of St. Mary's, I felt the best way to get the atmosphere of this visit would be to get together for a talk the people who remembered Gilbert. They would stimulate one another's memories. I invoked the aid of Sister Madaleva, and she suggested the two fathers, Leo Ward, Professor Engels and O'Grady, and, best of all, Johnny Mangan, the chauffeur. Johnny is a great institution at Notre Dame. He remembered driving my father nearly 30 years ago, and he had specially vivid memories of the Chesterton period. We all sat in a circle in Sister Madaleva's sitting room. I give here the notes I took. Johnny Mangan. It was the hardest job getting him into the car, harder getting him out. He'd walk on the porch and all the children came. He talked to the children on the road. Money meant nothing to him. The lady would give me the money, saying himself would leave it in the shop if the barber wasn't honest enough to give change. He enjoyed everything. When they dedicated the stadium, he stayed till the very end. Father O'Donnell introduced him to all the naval officers, and he was the last off the ground. He enjoyed talking to all the naval officers. He loved cheerleading. Mr. O'Grady. He spent one evening in Professor Phillips' room after the lecture from 9 to 2:30 a.m. His host was deaf, G.K. learnt later, and he made another date when he found his host had missed most of the fun. Mr. Engels. He would sit around consuming homemade ale by the quart, said the head of the philosophy faculty, made the best brew in the college. Enjoyed little drives around the countryside, and the faculty were a little shy of inviting him. In a lecture, he got an immense laugh by calling Queen Elizabeth an old crock. He then laughed above all the rest. Mr. Engels noticed mannerisms, the constant shifting of his great bulk around, rotating while he was talking, flipping his eyeglasses, lumbering onto the stage, going through all his pockets, finally finding a piece of dirty yellow paper and talking from it as if most laboriously gathered and learned notes. But the paper was only for show. Father Burke saw him get out of the cab. He got onto the stair landing and then saw GK's yellow paper on the ground. He had delivered his whole course with hardly a single note, occasionally looked through material for a quarter of an hour or so before speaking. All thought him a great entertainer as well as an informing talker. No one enjoyed himself more than he did. Trying to get him for an informal gathering, they mentioned, they had some Canadian ales, quite something in Prohibition days. GK, the ales have it. Johnny, he'd chat all the time he was driving. Father Leo L. Ward. The problem of getting GK to and fro in a coupe was only solved by backing him in. They remembered GK in Charlie's big chair, his hands barely touching over his great expanse. They recalled that on receiving his honorary doctorate, he said the last time he received one at Edinburgh, they tapped him with John Knox's hat. He did not expect anything so drastic here. Perhaps they might tap him with Tom Heflin's sombrero. Tom Heflin was the fiercely anti-Catholic senator from Alabama. When he had been invited to Notre Dame, he was not certain where it was, but with a name like that, even if it were in the mountains of the moon, he should feel at home. If I ever meet anybody who suggests there's something Calvinistic or puritanical in Catholicism, I shall ask, have you ever heard of the University of Notre Dame? Johnny, he'd do anything she said, or Miss Collins. They certainly had that man by the neck, but they took wonderful care of him. Mr. O'Grady, it was a very intelligent arrangement, and did they tidy him? Johnny, very much so. It was their business every evening. Sister Madaleva, did he walk on the campus and see the students? Johnny, he didn't walk much, only to Charlie Phillips' rooms. He didn't mind being a little late, but his lady and Miss Collins loaded him into the car to get him there on time. The woman they lodged with used to swear like a trooper, but she, the landlady, cried like a kid when they left, and he and the lady seemed lonesome after leaving her. In his spare time at the house, he would be drawing some fancy stuff. What did he talk about? Johnny, he'd just talk about the country. He'd admire the streams and things like that. I took him to the virgin forest, and I could hardly get him back. He even got out to notice the trees. He spent almost an hour. The women raved at me and said I must get him back at a certain time. He'd asked me the names of the trees. He loved rivers and would ask me about the fish. At one time, Father O'Donnell thought he should drive to Chicago or some big town, but he didn't care for towns. Said they all looked alike to him, so after that, we always went to the country. Someone asked, did he ever get grouchy? Johnny, he always had a smile, was always calling the kids over to talk to him. He'd touch one with his stick to make him look round and play with him, and then he'd laugh himself sick playing with them. The kids were always around him, the ones of 4 or 5 years. Those were the ones he'd noticed the most. He liked to ask them things, and then if they gave a good answer, he could get a good laugh at it. Mr. O'Grady, I know he enjoyed himself here. I met him in Ottawa afterwards. He was autographing a book. The pen was recalcitrant, and he shook it over the rug. Dear me, I'm always cluttering up people's rugs. His cousin in Ottawa had him completely surrounded by ashtrays, but the cigar had ash almost half-length, and it was falling everywhere. Father Ward. Father Miltner, one evening in pleasant fall weather, found GK on the porch. The campus was empty. He got a grunt in return to his greeting, tried 3 or 4 times, almost no answer. GK looked glum. Well, you're not very gay this evening. One should be given the luxury of a little private grouch once in a while. To Johnny, did he take the lecture business seriously? No. He just wanted 5 minutes on the porch when he would talk to no one but the kids. Mr. O'Grady, he said once, what I like about notes is that when once you begin, you can completely disregard them. He stood for the first lecture, but mostly he sat. He enjoyed a joke so much, and they enjoyed his enjoyment. Mr. Engels, for the first lecture he stood, Part of him stood behind the little rostrum. After that, he sat in a big table. Father Leo R. Ward was at Oxford when he debated that the law is a has, and was amazed at the way the undergraduates adored him. His opponent begged them not to vote for GK at this critical moment in the world's history. They cheered GK, but voted against him to make the other fellow feel good. Sister Madaleva: what did he do for recreation? Johnny: he did a lot of sketching, I guess you'd call it, and he'd read the papers. Sister Madaleva: did he like the campus? Johnny: very much. Did he ever go down to the grotto? Johnny: he's seen it, but he never got out of the car. Where did he go to church? Johnny: he came here to Notre Dame. He was close to 400 pounds, but he'd never give it away. He'd break an ordinary scale, I guess. I brought him under the main building. He got stuck in the door of the car. Father O'Donnell tried to help. Mr. Chesterton said it reminded him of an old Irish woman. Why don't you get out sideways? I have no sideways. To the debate with Darrow, Francis Taylor Patterson had gone a little uneasy lest Chesterton's arguments might seem somewhat literary in comparison with the trained scientific mind and rapier tongue of the famous trial lawyer. She found, however, that both trained mind and rapier tongue were the property of GKC. I have never heard Mr. Darrow alone, but taken relatively, when that relativity is to Chesterton, he appears positively muddle-headed. As Chesterton summed it up, he felt as if Darrow had been arguing all afternoon with his fundamentalist aunt and simply kept sparring with a dummy of his own mental making. When something went wrong with the microphone, Darrow sat back until it could be fixed, whereupon GKC jumped up and carried on in his natural voice. Science, you see, is not infallible. Chesterton had the audience with him from the start, and when it was over, everyone just sat there, not wishing to leave. They were loath to let the light die. From Chesterton, by Cyril Clemens, pages 67 to 68. As in England, so also in the States, Gilbert's debating was held to be far better than his straight lecturing. He never missed the opportunity for a quick repartee, and yet, when he scored, the audience felt that he did so with utter kindness. At a debate with Dr. Horace T. Bridges of the Ethical Cultural Society on Is Psychology a Curse?, Bishop Craig Stewart, who presided, describes how, in his closing remarks, Chesterton devastatingly sideswiped his opponent and wound up the occasion in a storm of laughter and applause. It is clear that I have won the debate, and we are all prepared to acknowledge that psychology is a curse. Let us, however, be magnanimous. Let us allow at least one person in this unhappy world to practice this cursed psychology, and I should like to nominate Dr. Bridges. The bishop on another occasion introduced Gilbert at a luncheon in Chicago by quoting Oliver Herford's lines. When plain folks such as you and I see the sun sinking in the sky, we think it is the setting sun, but Mr. Gilbert Chesterton is not so easily misled. He calmly stands upon his head and upside down obtains a new and Chestertonian point of view, observing thus how from his nose the sun creeps closer to his toes. He cries in wonder and delight, how fine the sunrise is tonight. The fact that nearly all the headlines he chose sounded like paradoxes, the fact that they did not themselves agree with him, had on Chesterton's opponents and on some members of his audience one curious effect. Dr. Bridges, when asked his opinion of the late sparring partner, after paying warm tribute to his brilliance as a critic, his humor and his great personal charm, discovered in his subconscious, Is Psychology a Curse?, a certain intellectual recklessness that made him indifferent to truth and reality. Fundamentally, perhaps I should say subconsciously, he was a thoroughgoing skeptic and acted upon the principle that since we cannot really be positive about anything, we had better believe what it pleases us to believe. So too at the British University of Aberystwyth, when Chesterton spoke on liberty, taking first historically the fights of barons against despots, yeomen against barons, factory hands against owners, and then giving as a modern instance the fight of the pedestrian to keep the liberty of the highway. We are told that the senior history lecturer and some others were of the opinion that the whole thesis of the address was a gigantic leg pull. Chesterton must have seen again the fixed stare on the faces of the Nottingham tradesmen 30 years earlier on the famous occasion when he himself got up and played with water. But that earlier audience had the intellectual advantage over the university professors that they tried to find out what he meant with infinite inquiring. Gilbert often said that his comic illustrations ought not to have prevented this, but it was really more his inability to resist making himself into a figure of fun. He was funny, and the jokes were funny, but they did prevent his really being given all the position given him by so many of the modern Dr. Johnson. It is possible, though not easy, to imagine Johnson dragged from the station to his hotel by 40 undergraduates of Aberystwyth, while members of the OTC secured a footing on the carriage, armed with a battle axe, borrowed from the arts department, hoes, rakes, spades, etc., their officers having refused them the privilege of bearing arms on the occasion. But it is scarcely possible to imagine the doctor called upon for a speech standing on the steps of the hotel and saying, "You need never be ashamed of the athletic prowess of this college. The pyramids, we are told, were built by slave labor, but the slaves were not expected to haul the pyramids in one piece." Chesterton, by Cyril Clemens, page 50. In San Francisco, I saw many people who had met Gilbert, including a journalist who took him to a bootleg joint, which is Western for a speakeasy. There, he asked for some specialty of the house and was offered a mule. "6 of these babies will put you on your ear," remarked the bartender. "What did he say about my ear?" Gilbert queried. He downed 3 of the potent mixture, in spite of his theory against cocktails, and his host remarked his continued poise with admiration while the bartender commented, "He can take it," another slang expression that appeared to be new to Gilbert. He told his host, Mr. Williams, that he delighted in meeting such folk as bartenders, and all the simpler people whom he saw too seldom. This suggested an idea. Would he come out to a school across the bay which could not afford his fees, because it educated the daughters of poor Catholics? He agreed at once, and not only talked to them brilliantly for 3/4 of an hour, but also wrote for the children about 50 autographs. But of course, he had forgotten something. An engagement to attend a big social function. A huge car arrived at the school, complete with chauffeur and several agitated ladies. "Mr. Chesterton, you have broken an important engagement." "I have filled an important engagement," he answered, lecturing to the daughters of the poor. If it were possible for Gilbert to be better loved anywhere than in England, that anywhere was certainly America. From coast to coast, I have met his devotees. I have come across only one expression of the opposite feeling, and that from a man who seems, from his opening sentence, to have been unable to stay away from the lectures he so detested. I heard Chesterton some 6 or 7 times in this country. His physical makeup repelled me. He looked like a big eater, and animalism is repugnant to most of us. His appearance was against him. Not one of his lectures seemed to me worth the price of admission, and some of them were so bad that they seemed contemptuous morsels flung at audiences for whom he adjudged anything good enough. One of his lectures at the Academy, Brooklyn, was a great disappointment, and he charged $1,000 for it. It was not worth $10, and Chesterton knew it. After the lecture, he remarked to a friend of mine, "I think that was the worst lecture I ever gave." He may have been right. Certainly it was the worst I have ever heard him give. But he took the $1,000 and a bonus of $200 for the extra large crowd in attendance. No, I did not like Chesterton. What of the money? With his American agent, Chesterton had a quite unusual arrangement. He received half the fees paid. The agent made engagements, paid traveling expenses, and received for this the other half. Out of the half Chesterton received, he paid a further 10% to the London agent who had introduced him to the American agent, and he also had to pay the expenses of his wife and his secretary, and further gave a large present to his secretary for her trouble on the tour. The rest went chiefly to G.K.'s Weekly. I doubt if he could have told anyone at what figure the original fee stood for any lecture. One of the Brazilian fathers, then a novice, remembers Gilbert's appearance in Toronto. The subject of this lecture was culture and the coming peril. The coming peril, he explained, was not Bolshevism, because Bolshevism had now been tried. The best way to destroy a utopia is to establish it. The net result of Bolshevism is that the modern world will not imitate it. Nor by a coming peril did he mean another great war. The next great war, he added, would happen when Germany tried to monkey about with the frontiers of Poland. The coming peril was the intellectual, educational, psychological, artistic overproduction, which equally with economic overproduction threatened the well-being of contemporary civilization. People were inundated, blinded, deafened, and mentally paralyzed by the flood of vulgar and tasteless externals, leaving them no time for leisure, thought, or creation from within themselves. At question period, he was asked, "Why is Dean Inge gloomy?" "Because of the advance of the Catholic Church." "Next question, please." "How tall are you, and what do you weigh?" "I'm 6 feet 2 inches, but my weight has never been accurately calculated." "Is George Bernard Shaw a coming peril?" "Heavens, no. He is a disappearing pleasure." For an apparently haphazard collection of essays, Sidelights on New London and Newer York, published on his return to England from the second visit, has a surprising unity. Blitzed in London and out of print in New York, it is now hard to obtain, which is a pity, as it is full of good things. Discussing the fashions of today, Chesterton attempts to remove these things from the test of time and subject them to the test of truth. And this rule of an eternal test is the one he tried to apply in all his comments. Obviously, nothing human is perfect, and this includes the human judgment, even Chesterton's judgment. Talking of the past or of the present, of England or America, he may often have been wrong, and he would certainly have been the last man to claim infallibility for his judgments. His weakness as a critic was perhaps a tendency to get his proportions wrong, to make too much of some things he saw or experienced, too little of others. His qualities were intellectual curiosity and personal amiability, together with the measuring rod of an eternal standard. This second visit to America only deepened in Gilbert's mind many of the impressions made by the first. Yet the atmosphere of the book is curiously different from that of what I saw in America. Living in the country even a few months has so greatly deepened his understanding. He still preferred the Quakers to the Puritans. The essential of the Puritan mood is the misdirection of moral anger. He still felt that as a whole, the United States had started with a great political idea, but a small spiritual idea, that it needed a return to the vision in politics and sociology. It was the fashion today to laugh at the wish for great open spaces, yet the real sociological object in going to America was to find those open spaces. It was not to find more engineers and electric batteries and mechanical gadgets in the home. These may have been the result of America. They were not the causes of America. Asked why he admired America, yet hated Americanization, he replied, "I should have thought that I had earned some right to apply this obvious distinction to any foreign country, since I have consistently applied it to my own country. If egoism is excusable, I am myself an Englishman, which some identify with an egoist, and I have done my best to praise and glorify a number of English things, English inns, English roads, English jokes and jokers, even to the point of praising the roads for being crooked or the humor for being cockney. But I have invariably written, ever since I have written at all, against the cult of British imperialism. And when that perilous power and opportunity, which is given by wealth and worldly success, largely passed from the British Empire to the United States, I have applied exactly the same principle to the United States. I think imperialism is none the less imperialism, because it is spread by economic pressure or snobbish fashion rather than by conquest. Indeed, I have much more respect for the empire that is spread by fighting than the empire that is spread by finance." Sidelights on New London and Newer York, page 178. He felt that the real causes for admiration, the real greatness of America, could be found partly through facing its incompleteness and defects, partly through contemplating the character of the greatest and most typical of Americans, Abraham Lincoln. Whilst I was in America, I often lingered in small towns and wayside places, and in a curious and almost creepy fashion, the great presence of Abraham Lincoln continually grew upon me. I think it is necessary to linger a little in America, and especially in what many would call the most uninteresting or unpleasing parts of America, before this strong sense of a strange kind of greatness can grow upon the soul. The externals of the Middle West affect an Englishman as ugly, and yet ugliness is not exactly the point. There are things in England that are quite as ugly or even uglier. Rows of red brick villas in the suburbs of a town in the Midlands are, one would suppose, as hideous as human half-wittedness could invent or endure. But they are different. They are complete. They are, in their way, compact, rounded, and finished with an effect that may be prim and smug, but is not raw. The surroundings of them are neat, if it be in a niggling fashion. But American ugliness is not complete, even as ugliness. It is broken off short. It is ragged at the edges. Even its worthy objects have around them a sort of halo of refuse. Somebody said of the rugged and sardonic Dr. Temple, once Archbishop of Canterbury, "There are no polished corners in our temple." There are no polished corners even in the great American cities, which are full of fine and stately classical buildings, not unworthy to be compared to temples. Nobody seems to mind the juxtaposition of unsightly things and important things. There's some deep difference of feeling about the need for completeness and harmony, and there's the same thing in the political and ethical life of the great Western nation. It was out of this landscape that the great president came, and one might almost trace a fanciful shadow of his figure in the thin trees and stiff wooden pillars. A man of any imagination might look down these strange streets, with their frame houses filled with the latest conveniences and surrounded with the latest litter, till he could see approaching down the long perspective that long, ungainly figure with the preposterous stove-pipe hat and the rustic umbrella and deep, melancholy eyes, the humor and the hard patience and the heart that fed upon hope deferred. Sidelights on New London and Newer York, page 168 to 170. Among the stately and classical buildings were those making up the University of Notre Dame, where he had been lecturing, and which turned his musings in a direction they were ever inclined to take. Founded by a group of Frenchmen a century ago with a capital of $400 in a small log building on a clearing of 10 acres, the university today numbers 45 buildings on a 1,700-acre campus. The gold dome of the church visible from miles away, the interesting combination of the extraordinary fame of its football team with a keen spiritual life, especially fascinated Gilbert. He wrote a poem dedicated to the university and called The Arena. In it, he pictures first the golden image of the gilded house of Nero that stood for all the horrors of the pagan amphitheater. Then comes in contrast another image. I have seen where a strange country opened its secret plains about me. One great golden dome stand, lonely with its golden image one, seen afar in strange fulfillment, through the sunlit Indian summer, that apocalyptic portent that has clothed her with the sun. The boys shout Notre Dame as they watch the fortunes of the fray, and Chesterton sees Our Lady presiding fittingly even over a football contest. And I saw them shock the whirlwind of the world of dust and dazzle, and thrice they stamped a thunderclap, and thrice the sand-wheel swirled, and thrice they cried like thunder, on Our Lady of the Victories, the mother of the master, of the masterers of the world. He recurs to a favorite thought that the mother of sorrows is the cause of human joy. Queen of death and deadly weeping, those about to live salute thee, youth untroubled, youth untortured, hateless war and harmless mirth, and the new lord's larger largesse, holier bread and happier circus, since the queen of sevenfold sorrow has brought joy upon the earth. No wonder that, as Johnny Mangan said, you could not drag him away from the game, if the game meant also a meditation. The holier bread came perhaps to his mind from the fact that the average of daily communion is unusually high at Notre Dame. When he desired for Americans a return to their great political vision, he also desired an opening of the eyes to that greater spiritual vision which was to him the supreme opportunity of the human spirit. E.S.P. Haynes, in Frito Misto, comments on the absence of any reference to universities in What I Saw in America. Nor have I anywhere found any discussion by Chesterton of the intellectual quality of Catholic education, any comparison with the secular teaching, either in England or in America. But that the problems of these two countries and of all the world could be solved only by what that golden dome housed, he cried with no uncertain voice. Death is in the world around, resurrection in the church of the God who died and rose again. Queen of death and life undying, those about to live salute thee. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. Chapter 29. The Soft Answer. I have only one virtue that I know of I could really forgive unto 70 times 7. The Notebook. One of the commonest of biographers' problems is the question of quarrels and broken friendships. At the distance of time separating a life from its record, some of these look so empty of meaning as to imperil any reputation. Yet they happened, and when they were happening they probably appeared full of significance. Other quarrels involve issues of importance in which the biographer cannot take wholeheartedly the side of his hero. Thus, my own father, writing his father's life, had to pronounce judgment on Newman's side in the issues that divided them. Yet later, writing Newman's biography, he had to admit the faults of temper that at least weakened the cardinal's case, for only so could he tell an entirely truthful story. In Chesterton's life, there is no such problem. Attacks on public characters in his paper, attacks on abuses and ideas, absorbed all his pugnacity. Fellow writers, rival journalists, friends furnished often enough material for a quarrel, but Chesterton would never take it up. He excelled in the soft answer, not that answer which seeming soft subtlety provokes to wrath, but the genuine article. Belloc said of him that he possessed the two virtues of humility and charity, those most royal of all Christian virtues. In the heat of argument he retained a fairness of mind that saw his opponent's case and would never turn an argument into a quarrel. And most people both liked him and felt that he liked them. While he was having his great controversy with Blatchford back in 1906, it is clear from letters between them that the two men remained on the friendliest terms. Edward MacDonald writes of his experiences of Chesterton when he was working with him on the paper. He loved all the jokes about his size. He was the first to see the point and to roar with laughter when Douglas Woodruff introduced him to a meeting as Mr. Chesterton, who has just been looking round in America. He came into the office once on press day and saw the disordered pile of papers and proofs on my desk. The place was certainly in an awful mess. I wanted to show him a particular letter and shoved my hand into the middle of one pile and was lucky enough to put my hand right on the right document. GKC complimented me on a filing system that demanded a keen memory and then remarked enviously, "I wish they'd let me have a desk like that at home." When Derek Thomas drew his famous cartoon of GKC milking a cow, he hesitated to give it to me for fear that GKC would be offended. I wanted to print it in a special number and telephoned to Beaconsville. "Mr. Chesterton, I have a cartoon of Derek and would like to put it in the special number. But as you are the subject of the cartoon, Derek is afraid you might not like it." "I would rather it were not printed," he replied. "I never liked the idea of my name being used in the title of the paper and don't want well-intentioned but embarrassing personalities. Of course, if it were highly satirical, insulting, and otherwise unflattering, I'd gladly have it on the front page." I assured him that it was anything but flattering, and on the front page it went. It was used as the frontispiece of GK's miscellany. Many of the obituary writers said that he hated the cinema. In fact, he told me once that he had long wished to write a new translation of Cyrano and would like to try his hand at a film scenario of the play. His fingers had itched in the first place to retranslate the duel scene in order to restore the strength of the ballade in English. When he saw the film version of a Father Brown story, I asked him what he thought of it. He had liked the film as a film and the acting. He added as an afterthought, "It gave me an idea for a new Father Brown story." A shorthand note was taken of the famous debate with Bernard Shaw. It was decided to devote 4 pages of GK's Weekly to a report which I tried to compile by avoiding the third person and concentrating on significant quotations. But whereas Shaw put his points in a few words from which elaboration could be cut, GKC's argument was so closely knit that it was difficult to leave out passages without spoiling the effect. He walked into the room as my pencil went through a fairly long extract from Shaw's speech. "And whose words are you so gaily murdering?" he asked. "Shaw's, Mr. Chesterton." "Very well. Now put them all back and murder mine. I refuse to deny Shaw a full opportunity to state his case in my paper." As a result, Shaw's speech took up a great part of the space allotted, and GKC was inadequately reported. He was always careful, if he had reviewed a book in the paper criticizing its ideas, to take an opportunity to show the author his warm personal friendliness. Middleton Murray, sending him a book of his own, criticized GK as perverse for thinking communism and capitalism alike. "Your clean idea of liberty and property delights me, I believe, quite as much as it does you, but it is a vision and a dream in this capitalistic world. The communist is the man who has made up his mind to go through with the grim business of capitalism to the bitter end because he knows there is no going back. He makes a choice between following a dream which he knows is only a dream, and following a hope which he knows his own devotion may help to make real. Communism is the faith which a man wins through blank and utter despair. For my own part, if it were possible, I would rather see the world converted to Christianity than to communism. But the world has had its chance of becoming Christian. It will not get it again. The wrath to come, that is what communism is, and we can flee from it only by repentance. And repentance itself means communism. That is the fact as I see it. I hope, and sometimes dream, that we shall have the communism of repentance, and not the communism of wrath here in England." Chesterton replied May 19, 1932. "Thank you so much for your most interesting and generous letter, which reached me indirectly and was delayed. Also for your most interesting and generous book, which I immediately sat down and read at a sitting, which in its turn so stimulated me that I immediately wrote a rapid and rather curt reply for my own little rag. I fear you will find the reply more controversial than I meant it to be. For your book is so packed with challenges that I could not but make my very short article a thing packed with mere repartees. But I do hope you will understand how warm a sympathy I have with very much of what you say, and with all the motives with which you say it. Needless to say, I agree with every word you say against capitalism. But I particularly want to congratulate you on what you say about parasitic parliamentary labor. I thought that chapter was quite triumphant. As for the rest, it is true that it has not shaken me in my conviction that the Catholic Church is larger than you or me, than your moods or mine. And the heroic but destructive mood in which you write is a very good example. You say that Christ set the example of a self-annihilation, which seems to me almost nihilist. But I will never deny that Catholics have saluted that mood as the imitation of Christ. Lately, a friend of mine, young, virile, handsome, happily circumstanced, walked straight off and buried himself in a monastery, never, so to speak, to reappear on earth. Why did he do it? Psychologically, I cannot imagine. Not certainly from fear of hell or wish to be rewarded by heaven. As an instructed Catholic, he knew as well as I do that he could save his soul by normal living. I can only suppose that there is something in what you say, that Christ and others do accept a violent reversal of all normal things. But why do you say that Christ did it and has left no Christians who do it? Our church has stood in the derision of 400 years because there were still Christians who did it, and they did it to themselves as Christ did. You will not misunderstand me if I say that this is different from throwing out a violent theory for other people to follow. Now for the application. Some of these monks, less cloistered, are to my knowledge helping the English people to get back to the ownership of their land, renewing agriculture as they did in the Dark Ages. Why do you say there is no chance for this normal property and liberty? You can only mean to say of our scheme exactly what you yourself admit about the communist scheme, that it requires awful and almost inhumane sacrifices, that we must turn the mind upside down, that we must alter the whole psychology of modern Englishmen. We must do that to make them communists. Why is it an answer to say we must do that to make them distributists? I could point out many ways in which our ideal is nearer and more native to men, but I will not prolong this debate. I should be very sorry that you should think it is only a debate. I only ask you to believe that we sympathize where we do not agree, but on this we do not agree. Mr. Murray wrote later of Gilbert, I like the man immensely, and he was a very honorable opponent of mine. much the most honorable I have ever encountered. GK's Weekly was of course Gilbert's own platform, so perhaps his care to apologize and his great magnanimity are more remarkable in incidents outside its columns. T.S. Eliot had his platform. He edited The Criterion. Chesterton, on being reproached by him for a hasty article, not only apologized, but dedicated a book to Mr. Eliot. He had written confusing him with another critic who disapproved of alliteration, and had also misquoted a stanza of his poetry. Mr. Eliot had written, "I should like you to know that it was apparently your sympathetic reviewer, not I, who made the remark about alliteration," to which it seems he added a more general criticism of mine. So that snob is not the right corrective. Some of your comments seem to be based on a belief that I object to alliteration. And may I add, as a humble versifier, that I prefer my verse to be quoted correctly, if at all. Chesterton replied, "I am so very sorry if my nonsense in the Mercury had any general air of hostility. To say nothing of any incidental injustices of which I was quite unaware, I meant it to be quite amiable, like the tremulous badinage of the oldest inhabitant in the bar parlour, when he has been guyed by the brighter lads of the village. I cannot imagine that I ever said anything about you or any particular person being a snob, for it was quite out of my thoughts and too serious for the whole affair. I certainly did have the impression, from the way the reviewer put it, that you disapproved of my alliteration. I also added that you would be quite right if you did. I certainly did quote you from memory, and even quote from a quotation. I also mentioned that I was doing so casual a thing. Of course, on the strictest principles, all quotations should be verified, and I should certainly have done so if I had in any way resented anything you said, or been myself writing in a spirit of resentment. If you think a letter to the Mercury clearing up these points would be fair to everybody, of course I should be delighted to write one." This attitude of the oldest inhabitant was the Chestertonian fashion of accepting the youthful demand for something new. When a young writer in Colosseum alluded to him as out of date, he took it with the utmost placidity. "Good," he said to Edward MacDonald. "I like to see people refusing to accept the opinions of others before they've examined them themselves. They're perfectly entitled to say that I'm not a literary lion, but a Landseer lion." Mr. Eliot's answer was a request to Gilbert to write in the Criterion, and an explanation that he had felt in a false position since he rather liked alliteration than otherwise. Thus, too, when Chesterton had answered a newspaper report of a speech made by C.E.M. Joad, the latter complained that it was a criticism, not of anything that I think, but of a garbled newspaper caricature of a few of the things I think, taken out of their context and falsified. He added that he had not said science would destroy religion, but that at its present rate of decline the Church of England would become a dead letter in 150 years. Next, that science has no bearing upon the spiritual truths of religion, but has been presented, at any rate by the Church of England, in a texture of obsolete ideas about the nature of the physical universe and the behavior of physical things, which science has shown to be untrue. Finally, that religion is vital, but it is in mysticism that the core of religion lies for me, and mystical experience, as I understand it, does not want organizing. I may be wrong in all this, but I hope that this explanation, such as it is, will lead you to think that I am not such an arrogant fool as your article suggests. Chesterton replied, May 4, 1930, "I hope you will forgive my delay in thanking you for your very valuable and reasonable letter. But I have been away from home, and for various reasons my correspondence has accumulated very heavily. I am extremely glad to remember that, even before receiving your letter, I was careful to say in my article that my quarrel was not personally with you, but with the newspapers which had used what you said as a part of a stupid stunt against organized religion. I am even more glad to learn that they had misused your name and used what you did not say. I ought to have known, by this time, that they are quite capable of it, and I entirely agree with the correction you make in the report makes all the difference in the world. I do not think I ever meant or said that you were an arrogant fool or anything like it. But most certainly it is one thing to say that religion will die in a century, as the report stated, and quite another to say that the Church of England will experience a certain rate of decline, whether the prediction be true or no. I shall certainly take some opportunity to correct my statement prominently in the Illustrated London News. I hope I should do so in any case. But in this case it supports my main actual contention, that there is in the press a very vulgar and unscrupulous attack on the historic Christian Church. The 4 points you raise are so interesting that I feel I ought to touch on them, though you will forgive me if I do so rather rapidly. With the first I have already dealt, and in that matter I can only apologize, both for myself and my unfortunate profession. And touching the second, I do not suppose we should greatly disagree. I merely used it as one example of the futility of the fatalistic prophecies such as the one attributed by the newspapers to you. But a thorough debate between us, if there were time for it, touching the third and fourth points, might possibly remove our differences, but would certainly reveal them. In the third paragraph, you say something that has been said many times and doubtless means something, but I can say quite honestly that I have never been quite certain of what it means. Naturally, I hold no brief for the Church of England as such. Indeed, I am inclined to congratulate you on having found any one positive set of ideas, obsolete or not, which that church is solidly agreed in presenting. But I have been a member of that church myself, and in justice to it, I might say that neither then nor now did I see clearly what are these things about the nature of the physical universe, which science has shown to be untrue. I was not required as an Anglican, any more than as a Catholic, to believe that God had 2 hands and 10 fingers to mold Adam from clay. But even if I had been, it would be rather difficult to define the scientific discovery that makes it impossible. I should like to see the defined Christian dogma written down and the final scientific discovery written against it. I have never seen this yet. What I have seen is that even the greatest scientific dogmas are not final. We have just this moment agreed that the ideas of the physical universe, which are really and truly obsolete, are the very ideas taught by physicists 30 years ago. What I think you mean is that science has shown miracles to be untrue. But miracles are not ideas about the nature of the physical universe. They are ideas about the nature of a power capable of breaking through the nature of the physical universe. And science has not shown that to be untrue for anybody who can think. Lastly, you say that it is indeed necessary that religion should exist, but that its essence is mysticism. And this does not need to be organized. I should answer that nothing on earth needs to be organized so much as mysticism. You say that man tends naturally to religion. He does indeed, often in the form of human sacrifice or the temples of Sodom. Almost all extreme evil of that kind is mystical. The only way of keeping it healthy is to have some rules, some responsibilities, some definitions of dogma and moral function. That, at least, as you yourself put it, is what I think, and I hope you will not blame me for saying so. But as to what I said in that particular article, it was quite clearly written upon wrong information, and it will give me great pleasure to do my best to publish the fact. In any such argument, Gilbert was never, in the words of the Gospel, willing to justify himself. He only wanted to justify certain ideas, and the thought of having misrepresented anyone else was distressing to him. Even the hardened controversialist Colton wrote in the course of one of their arguments, "If I speak very plainly of your historical methods, it is not that I do not fully respect your conversion. I have more sympathy with your Catholicity than, partly no doubt by my own fault, you may be inclined to think. I believe you too have made a sacrifice of the sort that is never altogether vain. It is therefore part of my faith that you are near to that which I also am trying to approach. And if this belief does little or nothing to color my criticisms in this particular discussion, that is because I believe true Catholicism, like true Protestantism, can only gain by explosion of historical falsehoods, if indeed they be false, with the least possible delay. If, on the other hand, they are truths, then you may be trusted to make out the best possible case for them, and my words will recoil upon myself." The dispute was about Puritanism and Catholicism. It was republished as a pamphlet. It is the only case I have found in which Chesterton wrote several versions of one letter to the Cambridge Review. In its final form, he omitted one illuminating illustration. Colton had maintained that the medievals condemned dancing as much as the Puritans, and had dug up various moldy theologians who classed it as a mortal sin. Father Lopez retorted by a quotation from St. Thomas, saying it was quite right to dance at weddings and on such like occasions, provided the dancing was of a decent kind. Chesterton comments, "We have already traveled very far from the first vision of Mr. Colton, of dark ages full of one monotonous wail over the mortal sin of dancing. To class it seriously as a mortal sin is to class it with adultery or theft or murder, It is interesting to imagine St. Thomas and the moderate moralist saying, "You may murder at weddings, you may commit adultery to celebrate your release from prison, you may steal if you do not do it with immodest gestures," and so on. The calm tone of St. Thomas about the whole thing is about evidence of a social atmosphere different from that described. The rest of his analysis of Colton's method of dealing with a historical document and distorting it is in the published version. A valuable part of Chesterton's line is also interesting as a comment on his own historical work. The expert, he says, is so occupied with detail that he overlooks the broad facts that anyone could see. On this point of review of Colton's medieval history in the Church Times is illuminating. The reviewer noted that in the index under the word church occurred such notes as soldiers sleeping in, horses stabled in, and other allusions to extraordinary happenings. But nowhere, he said, could he find any mention of the normal use of a church, that men prayed in it. With H.G. Wells, several interchanges of letters have shown in earlier chapters how the soft answer turned aside a wrath easily aroused, but also easily dissipated. Another exchange of letters only 3 years before Gilbert's death must be given. The third letter is undated, and I am not sure if it belongs here or refers to another of Gilbert's reviews of a book of Wells. 47 Chiltern Court, NWI, December 10th, 1933. Dear old GKC, an illustrated London News Xmas cutting comes like the season's greetings. If after all my atheology turns out wrong and your theology right, I feel I shall always be able to pass into heaven, if I want to, as a friend of GKC's. Bless you. My warmest good wishes to you and Mrs. GKC. H.G. My dear H.G., I do hope my secretary let you know that at the moment when I got your most welcome note, I was temporarily laid out in bed and able to appreciate it, but not to acknowledge it. As to the fine point of theology you raise, I am content to answer, with the subtle and exquisite irony of the Yanks, I should worry. If I turn out to be right, you will triumph, not by being a friend of mine, but by being a friend of man. By having done 1,000 things for men like me in every way from imagination to criticism. The thought of the vast variety of that work, and how it ranges from towering visions to tiny pricks of humor, overwhelmed me suddenly in retrospect, and I felt we had none of us ever said enough. Also your words, apart from their generosity, please me as the first words I have heard for a long time of the old agnosticism of my boyhood, when my brother Cecil and my friend Bentley almost worshipped old Huxley like a god. I think I have nothing to complain of, except the fact that the other side often forget that we began as free thinkers as much as they did, and there was no earthly power but thinking to drive us on the way we went. Thanking you again 1,000 times for your letter, and everything else. Yours always, G.K. Chesterton. My dear Chesterton, you write wonderful praise, and it leaves me all a-quiver. My warmest thanks for it. But indeed that wonderful fairness of mind is very largely a kind of funk in me. I know the creature from the inside. Funk and something worse, a kind of deep, complex cunning. Well, anyhow you take the superficial merit with infinite charity. And it has inflated me, and just for a time I am an air balloon over the heads of my fellow creatures. Yours always, H.G. Wells. Gilbert loved to praise his fellows in the field of letters even when their philosophy differed from his own. In the obituaries in G.K.'s Weekly, this is especially noticeable. Of 2 men of letters who died in 1928, he wrote with respect and admiration, although with a mind divided between pure literary appreciation and those principles whereby he instinctively measured all things. Of Sir Edmund Gosse he wrote, "The men from whom we would consent to learn are dying." G.K. felt he could never himself appreciate without judging, but he could learn from Gosse a uniquely sensitive impartiality. With him there passes away a great and delicate spirit which might in some sense be called the spirit of the 18th century, which might indeed be very rightly called the spirit of reason and civilization. May 26, 1928. These are the things we hoped would stay, and they are going, he quoted from Swinburne, and of him and of Hardy he died in 1928. And in whom he saluted in honorable dignity and simplicity he felt that though they had stated something false about the universe, that all the good things are fugitive and only the bad things unchanged, yet something rather like it might be half-truth about the world. I mean about the modern world. These poets lamented the passing of roses and sunbeams, but in the modern world, it is rather as if, in some inverted witchcraft, the rose tree withered and faded from sight, and the rose leaves remained hovering in empty air. It is as if there could be sunbeams when there was no more sun. It is not only the better, but the bigger and stronger part of a thing that is sacrificed to the small and secondary. The real evil in the exchange that has been passing over society is the fact that it has sapped foundations and, worse still, has not shaken the palaces and spires. It is as if there was a disease in the world that only devours the bones. We have not weakened the gilded parody of marriage, we have only weakened the marriage. We have not abolished the House of Lords because it was not democratic. We have merely preserved the aristocracy on condition that it shall not be aristocratic. We have not yet even disestablished the church, but there is a very pressing proposal that we should turn out of it the only people who really believe it is the church. There is now in the minds of nearly all capitalists a sort of corrupt communism. The bank remains, the fund remains, the foreign financier remains, parliamentary procedure remains, Jix remains. These are the things we hoped would go, but they are staying. 16 years earlier, Chesterton had in The Victorian Age in Literature characterized Hardy's novels as the village atheist brooding and blaspheming over the village idiot. Yet Cyril Clemens has told me that Hardy recited to him some of Chesterton's poetry, and I think this obituary links with that fact in showing that a profound difference in their philosophy of life did not prevent a mutual appreciation and even admiration. Gilbert Chesterton entered the last years of his life having made no enemies in the exceedingly sensitive literary world to which he primarily belonged. Whether he had made any in the world of politics, I do not know, but he certainly felt no enmities. He said once it was impossible to hate anything except an idea, and to him I think it was. Against one politician who died in 1930, he had many years ago launched his strongest bit of ironical writing. Lord Birkenhead, then F.E. Smith, who had spoken of the Welsh Disestablishment Bill as having shocked the conscience of every Christian community in Europe. The last lines of Chesterton's mordant answer ran, "For your legal cause or civil, you fight well and get your fee. For your God or dream or devil, you will answer not to me. Talk about the pews and steeples and the cash that goes therewith, but the souls of Christian peoples, chuck it, Smith." Later, Smith had stood with Sir Edward Carson against Cecil Chesterton at the Old Bailey. Now he was dead, and many who had feared him in his lifetime were blackening his memory with subtle sneers and innuendo. Gilbert refused to join in this, and he wrote in his paper, "In him we were confronted by and fought, not a set of principles, but a man. Lord Birkenhead was a great fighter. With one more pagan virtue, pride, he would have been a great pagan." Lord Balfour died in the same year. With him neither the paper nor its editor had fought personally, but upon almost all his policies had stood in opposition. Yet few better appreciations of him appeared in the article entitled by Chesterton, "A Man of Distinction." The English squire was an unconscious aristocrat. The Scotch laird was a conscious aristocrat. And Lord Balfour, with all his social grace and graciousness, was conscious and even self-conscious. But this was only another way of saying that he had a mind which mirrored everything, including himself, and that whatever else he did not act blindly or in the dark. He was sometimes quite wrong, but his airs were purely patriotic, both in the narrow sense of nationalism and in the larger sense of loyalty and disinterestedness. He instances Balfour's policies in Ireland and Egypt and continues, "In some ways he seems to me to have been too good a Stoic to be entirely a good Christian, or rather, to put it more correctly, to feel, like the rest of us, that he was a bad Christian. There was much more in him of the Scotch Puritan than of the English Cavalier. It is supremely characteristic of the present parliamentary atmosphere that everybody accused Lord Balfour of incomprehensible compromise and vagueness, because he was completely logical and absolutely clear. Clarity does look like a cloud of confusion to people whose minds live in confusion twice confounded. People said his distinctions were fine distinctions, and so they were, very fine indeed. A fine distinction like a fine painting or a fine poem or anything else fine, a triumph of the human mind, the great power of distinction by which a man becomes in the true sense distinguished." March 29, 1930. The distinction Mr. Swinnerton draws between Belloc and Chesterton may be a little too absolute, but substantially it is right. One reason for the love of Chesterton was that while he fought, he sang lays of chivalry, and in spite of all his seriousness, warred against wickedness rather than a fleshly opponent, while Belloc sang only after the battle and warred against men as well as ideas. Jorgensen, page 88. Did the tendency to find good in his opponents? Did Chesterton's universal charity deaden, as Belloc believes, the effect of his writing? He wounded none, but thus also he failed to provide weapons wherewith one may wound and kill folly. Now without wounding and killing, there is no battle, and thus, in this life, no victory, but also no peril to the soul through hatred. The place of Chesterton in English letters, page 81. In various controversies during the final years of G.K.'s Weekly, the very opposite opinion is expressed. Hoffman Nickerson writes about the subversive nature of Chesterton's work, of giving weapons to communism and doing his bit towards starting a very nasty class war in America. Mr. Nickerson was also to develop this theme in a series of articles in Chesterton's own paper. Correspondents, too, complained often enough in the paper of its attacks on vested interest and on other schools of thought than its own. In the course of a controversy with Mr. Pinty, in which I think G.K. most distinctly misunderstood his opponent, but in which both men kept the friendliest tone, Pinty says that Chesterton treats as a drive much that he himself would call a drift, that the mind is more in fault than the will of mankind in getting the world into its present mess. With this diagnosis, Chesterton certainly agreed for the greater part of mankind. He spoke often of a madness in the modern mind. Psychology meant the mind studying itself instead of studying the truth, and it was part of what had destroyed the mind. Advertisements often tell us to watch this blank space. I confess I do not watch that blank space, the modern mind, not so much for what will appear in it, as for what has already disappeared from it. Thus, too, when the Reverend Dick Shepherd remarrying a divorced woman, i.e., encouraging her to take again the solemn vow she had already broken, said that he heard the voice of Christ. Go in peace. It was not for impiety that Chesterton condemned him. He wrote with restraint, "There is scarcely a shade of difference left between meaning well and meaning nothing." Was Pinty still right in thinking he saw a drive where he ought to see a drift, and Nickerson in thinking he was dangerously subversive in his attitude to the rich? And anyhow, what about Belloc? I incline to think that the truth was that while G.K. could never hate an individual, he could hate a group. If he suddenly remembered an individual in that group, he hastily expected him from the group in order to leave the objects of his hatred entirely impersonal. Thus he hated politicians but found real difficulty in hating a politician. He hated what he called the plutocracy, but no individual rich man. I do not think, however, that while believing firmly in original sin, he was somewhat inclined to see it as operative more especially in the well-to-do classes. His championship of the poor was in no way impersonal. His burning love and pity went out to every beggar. He tended to love all men, but the poor he loved with an undivided heart. And when he thought of them, his thoughts grew harsh towards the rich, who were collectively their oppressors. I doubt if he allowed enough for a degree of stupidity required to amass a fortune. He would have agreed that love of money narrowed the mind. I doubt if he fully grasped that only a mind already narrow can love money so exclusively as to pursue it successfully. And I am pretty sure he did not allow enough for the fact that rich, like poor, are caught today in the machinery they have created. He saw the bewildered, confused laborer who has lost his liberty. He failed to see the politician also bewildered, the millionaire also confused, afraid to let go for fear he might be submerged. And yet at moments he did see it. He wrote in the paper a short series of articles on men in the 19th century who had created the confusion of today on Malthus, Adam Smith, and Darwin. Far from its being true that supernatural religion had first been destroyed and morality lost in consequence, it had been the Christian morality that was first destroyed in the mind. G.K. surmised Adam Smith's teachings as, God so made the world that he could achieve the good if men were sufficiently greedy for the goods. Thus the man of today, whenever he is tempted to be selfish, half remembers Smith and self-interest. Whenever he would harden his heart against a beggar, he half remembers Malthus and a book about population. Whenever he has scruples about crushing a rival, he half remembers Darwin, and his scruples become unscientific. Because none of these theories were in their own day seen as heresies and denounced as heresies, they have lived on vaguely to poison the atmosphere and the mind of today. English conservatives had been shocked when Chesterton began. Mr. Nickerson was shocked when he was ending, because he demanded a revolution. Surely Mr. Nickerson said, if he looked at communism closely, he would prefer capitalism. He not only would, he constantly said he did, but he wanted a revolution from both. He preferred that it should not be nasty, for what he wanted was the Christian revolution. Like all revolutions, however, it must begin in the mind, and he felt less and less hopeful as he watched the blank space. But I do not believe that Chesterton failed because he had not at his command the weapon of hatred. Here, Belloc surely makes the same mistake that Swift, whom he instances, made, and for the same reason. The Frenchman and the Irishman understand the rapier of biting satire, as does not the Englishman. For direct abuse of anyone, no matter how richly merited, nearly always puts the Englishman on the side of the man who is being abused. What happened to Swift's Gulliver, that most fierce attack upon the human race? The English people drew its sting and turned it into a nursery book that had delighted their children ever since. There are more ways than one of winning a battle. You can win the man instead of the argument, and Chesterton won many men. Or you can take a weapon that once belonged chiefly to the enemy but which Chesterton wrested from him, a very useful weapon, the laugh. Orthodoxy, doctrinal and moral, was a lawful object of amusement to Voltaire and his followers, but now the laugh has passed to the other side, and Chesterton was, with Belloc himself, the first to seize this powerful weapon. Thus, when Bishop Barnes of Birmingham said that St. Francis was dirty and probably had fleas, many Catholics were furious and spoke in solemn wrath. Chesterton wrote the simple verse, "A broad-minded bishop rebukes the verminous St. Francis. If Brother Francis pardon Brother Flea, there still seems need of such strange charity, seeing he is, for all his gay goodwill, bidden by funny little creatures still." I shall never forget going to hear Chesterton debate on birth control with some advanced woman or other. Outside the hall were numbers of her satellites offering their literature. I was just about to say something unpleasant to one of them when a verse flashed into my mind. "If I had been a heathen, I'd have crowned Neera's curls, and filled my life with love affairs, my house with dancing girls. But Higgins is a heathen, and to lecture rooms is forced, where his aunts who are not married demand to be divorced." The rebuke died on my lips. Why get angry with the poor old aunts of Higgins demanding the destruction of their unconceived and inconceivable babies? Swinburne had mocked at Christian virtue, but the Dolores of Chesterton replied to him, "I am sorry, old dear, if I hurt you. No doubt it is all very nice, with the lilies and languors of virtue, and the raptures of roses of vice. But the notion impels me to anger, that vice is all rapture for me, and if you think virtue is languor, just try it and see." But in fact, G.K. did not merely use laughter as a weapon. He was often simply amused, and did not conceal it. He told Desmond Gleeson that he remembered reading Renan's Christ, "while I was standing in the queue waiting to see Charlie's aunt, but it is obvious which is the better farce, for Charlie's aunt is still running." No wonder that Eileen Dugan, when she pictured him as a modern St. George, saw him shouting gleefully, "Bring on your dragons." Even dragons may be bothered by the unexpected. And it may well be that when the rapier of anger has been blunted against the armor of some accustomed fighter, he will be driven off the fields by gales of Chestertonian laughter. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois-Doyle. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward, Chapter 30. Our Lady's Tumbler. I hate to be influenced. I like to be commanded or to be free. In both of these, my own soul can take a clear and conscious part. For when I'm free, it must be for something that I really like, and not something that I am persuaded to pretend to like. And when I am commanded, it must be by something I know, like the 10 Commandments. But the thing called pressure, of which the polite name is persuasion, I always feel to be a hidden enemy. It is all a part of that worship of formlessness and flowing tendencies, which is really the drift of cosmos back into chaos. I remember how I suddenly recoiled in my youth from the influence of Matthew Arnold, who said many things very well worth saying when he told me that God was a stream of tendency. Since then, I have hated tendencies and liked to know where I was going and go there or refuse. GK's Weekly, August 18th, 1928. In 1932, when Gilbert had been in church just 10 years and Francis 6, my husband and I met them at the Eucharist Congress in Dublin. They were staying at the Viceregal Lodge and were very happy in that gathering of the Catholic world brought about by the Congress. It was this thought of the potential of the faith for a unity the League of Nations could not achieve. Only dogma is strong enough to unite mankind. That gave its title to the book Christendom in Dublin. In the crowd that thronged to that great gathering, he saw democracy. Its orderliness was more than a mere organization. It was self-determination of the people. A whole mob, what many would call a whole rabble, was doing exactly what it wanted, and what it wanted was to be Christian. The mind of the crowd was stretched over the centuries, as the faint sound of St. Patrick's bell, that had been silent so many centuries, was heard in Phoenix Park at the consecration of the Mass. It was stretched over the earth as the people of the earth gathered into one place, which had become for the time Rome, or the Christian center. During the Congress, an Eastern priest accosted GK with praise of his writings. His own mind full of the great ideas of Christendom and the faith, he felt a huge disproportion in the allusion to himself, and when later the priest asked to be photographed at his side, it flashed through GK's mind that he had heard in the East that an idiot was supposed to bring luck. This sort of humorous yet sincere intellectual humility startles us in the same kind of way as does the spiritual humility of the saints. We have to accept it in the same kind of way, without in the least understanding it, but simply because we cannot fail to see it. But the world could fail even to see it. It could and did fail in imagining a mind so absorbed in the contemplation of infinite greatness that its own pinpoint littleness became an axiom. Rather, it seemed an affectation. Nonetheless, an affectation, and much the less pardonable because the laughter was directed against others as well as against himself. There's an old medieval story of a Tumbler who converted and become a monk, found himself inapt in the offices of choir and scriptorium. So he went before a statue of Our Lady and there played all his tricks. Quite exhausted at last, he looked up at the statue and said, "Lady, this is a choice performance. There's more than a touch of Our Lady's tumbler in Gilbert." He knew he could give in his own fashion a choice performance, but meeting a priest come from a far land where he had reconciled a hitherto schismatic group with the great body of the Catholic Church, who could forgive sins and offer the holy sacrifice, he truly felt something disproportionate in finding one's own trivial trade, or tricks of the trade, amid the far-reaching revelations of such a triesting place of all the tribes of men. From Christendom in Dublin, page 35. His awe and reverence for priests was, says Father Rice, enormous. He would carefully weigh their opinion, however fatuous. His comment on the bad statues and fripperies, which so many Catholics find a trial, was, "It shows the wisdom of the Church. The whole thing is so terrific that if people did not have these letdowns, they would go mad." It may have been a fear of excess of this special letdown that made him reluctant to go to Lourdes. Lisieux he never liked, but he was, Dorothy says, fascinated by Lourdes when she persuaded him to go. He went several times to the torchlight procession, and he said, as he had said in Dublin, "This is the only real League of Nations." The thing he liked best in Dublin was the spontaneous outburst of little altars and amateur decorations in the poorest quarters of the city. The story he loved to tell was that of the old woman who said, when on the last day the clouds looking threatening, "Well, if it rains now, he will have brought it on himself." The year of the Congress, 2 other books were published, Sidelights on New London and Newer York, already discussed, and Chaucer. The books contrast agreeably, one throwing the ideal against the real of his own day, the other evoking his ideal from the past. The Chaucer was much criticized, chiefly because he was not a Chaucer scholar. As a matter of fact, the notion of his writing this book did not originate with Chesterton, but with Richard de la Mare, who had projected a series of essays called The Poets on the Poets. This developed, still at his suggestion, into a literary biography of Chaucer. But in any event, G.K. had all his life combated the notion that only a scholar should write on such themes. He stood resolutely for the rights of the amateur. Yet, I think the scholar might well start off with some exasperation on reading that if Chaucer had been called the father of English poetry, so had an obscure Anglo-Saxon like Caedmon, whose writing was not, in that sense, poetry, not in any sense English. It is a curious example of one of the faults Chesterton himself most hated. Overlooking something because it was too big, something, too, that he had realized in an earlier work, for Camden spoke the language of Alfred the Great. In a brilliant garnering of the fruits of her scholarship, word hoard, Margaret Williams has quoted Chesterton's Alfred as a stirring expression of the significance of the spiritual conquest of England by Christianity. In the same book, she shows how superficial is the view which believes that the English language was a creation of the Norman conquest. The struggle, she says, between the French and English tongues lasted for some 300 years, until the two finally blended into a unified language, basically Teutonic, richly romantic. The English spirit emerged predominant by a moral victory over its conqueror. From Word Hoard by Margaret Williams, page 4. No one would wish that Chesterton should have ignored the immense debt owed by our language to the French tributary that so enriched its main street, but it seems strange that in his hospitable mind, in which Alfred's England held so large a place, he should not have found room for an appreciation of the Saxon structure of Chaucer, and for all that makes him unmistakably one in a line, of which Caedmon was the first great poet. In this book, only his debt to France is stressed because England is to be thought of as part of Europe, and the part she is a part of is apparently France. Yet what excellent things there are in the book. The great poets exist to show the small man how great he is. The great poet is alone strong enough to measure that broken strength we call the weakness of man. The real vice of the Victorians was that they regarded history as a story that ended well because it ended with the Victorians. They turned all human records into one 3-volume novel, and were quite sure that they themselves were the 3rd volume. He quotes Troilus and Cressida on the Christian majesty of the mystery of marriage. Any man who really understands it does not see a Greek king sitting on an ivory throne, nor a feudal lord sitting on a false stool, but God in a primordial garden, granting the most gigantic of the joys of the children of men. When we talk of wild poetry, we sometimes forget the parallel of wild flowers. They exist to show that a thing may be more modest and delicate for being wild. Romance was a strange byproduct of religion, all the more because religion, through some of its representatives, may have regretted having produced it. Even the church, as imperfectly represented on its human side, contrived to inspire even what it had denounced and transformed even what it had abandoned. The best chapter is the last, the moral of the story, and that moral is that no man should desert that Catholic civilization. It can cure itself, but those who leave it cannot cure it. Not Nestorius, not Mohammed, nor Calvin, nor Lenin have cured, nor will cure the real evils of Christendom, for the severed hand does not heal the whole body. Healing must come from the recovery of the norm, of the balance, of the equilibrium that medieval philosophy and culture were always seeking. The meaning of Aquinas is that medievalism was always seeking a center of gravity. The meaning of Chaucer is that when found, it was always a center of gaiety. The name of Aquinas, thus introduced on almost the last page of this book, shows Chesterton's mind already busy on the next and perhaps the most important book of his life, St. Thomas Aquinas. Great news this, wrote Shaw to Francis, about the divine doctor. I've been preaching for years that intellect is a passion that will finally become the most ecstatic of all passions, and I've cherished Thomas as the most praiseworthy creature for being my forerunner on this point. When we were told that Gilbert was writing a book on St. Thomas and that we might have the American rights, my husband felt a faint quiver of apprehension. Was Chesterton for once undertaking a task beyond his knowledge? Such masses of research had recently been done on St. Thomas by experts of such high standing, and he could not possibly have read it all. nor should we have been entirely reassured had we heard what Dorothy Collins told us later concerning the writing of it. He began by rapidly dictating to Dorothy about half the book. So far, he had consulted no authorities, but at this stage, he said to her, "I want you to go to London and get me some books." "What books?" asked Dorothy. "I don't know," said G.K. She wrote, therefore, to Father O'Connor, and from him got a list of classic and more recent books on St. Thomas. G.K. flipped them rapidly through, which is, says Dorothy, the only way she ever saw him read, and then dictated to her the rest of his own book without referring to them again. There are no marks on any of them except a little sketch of St. Thomas, which was drawn in the margin opposite a description of the affair, which G.K. so vividly dramatizes, of Sigurd de Brabant. Had we known all this, we should have been asking ourselves even more definitely, what will the experts say? Of the verdict of the greatest of them, we were not long left in doubt. Etienne Gilson, who had given two of the most famous of philosophical lecture series, the Guilford Lectures at Aberdeen and the William James Lectures at Harvard, had begun his admiration for Chesterton with Greybeards at Play, and had thought Orthodoxy the best piece of apologetic the century had produced. When St. Thomas appeared, he said to a friend of mine, "Chesterton makes one despair. I've been studying St. Thomas all my life, and I could never have written such a book." After Gilbert's death, asked to give an appreciation, he returned to the same topic. "I consider it as being without possible comparison the best book ever written on St. Thomas. Nothing short of genius can account for such an achievement. Everybody will no doubt admit that it was a clever book, but the few readers who have spent 20 or 30 years in studying St. Thomas Aquinas, and who perhaps have themselves published 2 or 3 volumes on the subject, cannot fail to perceive that the so-called wit of Chesterton has put their scholarship to shame. He has guessed all that which they had tried to demonstrate, and he has said all that which they were more or less clumsily attempting to express in academic formulas. Chesterton was one of the deepest thinkers who ever existed. He was deep because he was right, and he could not help being right, but he could not either help being modest and charitable. So he left it to those who could understand him to know that he was right and deep. To others he apologized for being right, and he made up for being deep by being witty. That is all they can see of him. Chesterton by Cyril Clemens, pages 150 to 151. In joining church, Chesterton had found, like all converts from St. Paul to Cardinal Newman, that he had come into the land of liberty, especially of intellectual liberty. Conversion, he said, calls on a man to stretch his mind, as a man awakening from sleep may stretch his arms and legs. Well in Shallows, page 130. I suppose one reason why the surrounding world finds it hard to receive this statement from a convert is that he has only to look around him to see so many Catholics wrapped in slumbers as placid as the next man's. To this very real difficulty, and to all its implications, Chesterton unfortunately seldom averted. To that scandal wrought by evil Catholics, historical or contemporary, he was not blind. He summarized one element in the Reformation conflict. Bad men who had no right to their right reasoned good men who had good reason to be wrong. But I wish that with his rare insight into minds, he had analyzed us average Catholics. He might have startled us awake by explaining to non-Catholics how those who know such truths and feed upon such food can yet appear so dull and lifeless. Anyhow, whether the fault lie in part with us or entirely with the world at large, certain it is that in that world a convert is always expected to justify not merely his beliefs, but his sincerity in continuing to hold them. I wonder if the Pharisees said of St. Paul that they were sure he really wanted to return to his old allegiance, as some said it of Newman, or spoke, as Arnold Bennett did, that he accused Chesterton of being modernist in his secret thoughts. Were St. Paul's epistles an apologia pro vita sua? An apologia does not, of course, mean an apology, but a justification, and the ground on which justification was sometimes demanded amused Gilbert rather than annoying him. Playing the parlor game, which consists of guessing at what point in an article on hydraulics, elegiacs, or Neoplatonism Dean Inge will burst into his daily attack on the church, he wrote, "The Dean of St. Paul's got to business. in a paragraph in the second half of his article in which he unveiled to his readers all the horrors of a quotation from Newman, a very shocking and shameful passage in which the degraded apostate says that he is happy in his religion and in being surrounded by things of his religion, that he likes to have objects that have been blessed by the holy and beloved, and that there is a sense of being protected by prayers, sacramentals, and so on, and that happiness of this sort satisfies the soul. The dean, having given us this one ghastly glimpse of the cardinal's spiritual condition, drops the curtain with a groan and says, "It is paganism. How different from the Christian orthodoxy of Plotinus." The Thing, pages 156 to 157. This playful, not to say frivolous tone was fresh cause of annoyance to those who were apt to be annoyed. It is easier to understand their objection than the opposite one, that he became dull and prosy after he joined the church, or alternatively after he left Fleet Street for Beaconsfield. The only real difficulty about his later work arises from the riot of his high spirits. In his own style, I must say there are moments when even I want to read the riot act, and those who admire him less feel this more keenly. Bad puns, they say, wild and sometimes ill-mannered jokes are perhaps pardonable in youth, but in middle age they are inexcusable. The complainants against the Thing are in substance the complainants against orthodoxy, grown more vehement with the passage of years. The idea had been adumbrated of calling one of his books Joking Apart, and only rejected because of the fear that if he said he was not joking, everyone would be quite certain that he was. This greatly amused G.K., and he began the book. It actually appeared as The Well and the Shallows, with an apology for buffoons. After defending the human instinct of punning, he remarked that many moderns suffer from the disease of the suppressed pun. They are actuated even in their thinking by merely verbal association. I, for one, greatly prefer the sort of frivolity that is thrown to the surface like froth, to the sort of frivolity that festers under the surface like slime. To pelt an enemy with a foolish pun or two will never do him any grave injustice. The firework is obviously a firework, and not a deadly fire. It may be playing to the gallery, but even the gallery knows it is only playing. Well and Shallows, pages 11 and 12. Such playing was a necessity if the gallery, i.e. all the people, were to be made to listen, if the things you were thinking about were important to them as well as to yourself, if the ideas were more important than the dignity or reputation of the person who uttered them. In this book, Gilbert sketched briefly one side of his reason for feeling these ideas of paramount importance for everybody. My 6 conversions concerned reasons given him by the world that would have made him become a Catholic if he were not one already. He'd been brought up to treasure liberty, and in his boyhood, the world had seemed freer than the church. Today, in a world of fascism, communism, and bureaucracy, the church alone offered a reasoned liberty. He had been brought up to reverence certain ideals of purity. Today, they were laughed at everywhere but in the church, and the sure conclusions of science that had stood foursquare in his boyhood had become like a dissolving view. Liberalism had abdicated when the people of Spain freely chose the church, and English liberals defended the forcing upon them of a minority rule. There are no fascists, there are no socialists, there are no liberals, there are no parliamentarians. There is the one supremely inspiring and irritating institution in the world, and there are its enemies. Above all, he felt increasingly, as time went on, that those who left the faith did not get freedom, but merely fashion, that there was something ironic in the name the atheists chose when they called themselves secularists. By definition, they had tied themselves to the fashion of this world that passeth away. These 6 conversions, then, were what the world would have forced upon him, the church as an alternative to a continually worsening civilization. While he hated the utopias of the futurists, and while he accepted the Christian view of life as a probation, he felt too that life today was abnormally degraded and unhappy. There is a sense in which men may be made normally happy, but there's another sense in which we may truly say, without undue paradox, that what they want is to get back to their normal unhappiness. At present, they are suffering from an utterly abnormal unhappiness. They have got all the tragic elements essential to the human lot to contend with, time and death and bereavement and unrequited affection and dissatisfaction with themselves, but they have not got the elements of consolation and encouragement that ought normally to renew their hopes or restore their self-respect. They have not got vision or conviction or the mastery of their work or the loyalty of their household or any form of human dignity. Even the latest utopians, the last lingering representatives of that fated and unfortunate race, do not really promise the modern man that he shall do anything or own anything or in any effectual fashion be anything. They only promise that if he keeps his eyes open, he will see something. He will see the universal trust or the world state or Lord Melchett coming in the clouds in glory. But the modern man cannot even keep his eyes open. He is too weary with toil and long succession of unsuccessful utopias. He has fallen asleep. GK's Weekly, October 20th, 1928. Chesterton demanded urgently that the worldlings who had failed to make the world workable should abdicate. The organic thing called religion has in fact the organs that take hold on life. It can feed where the fastidious doubter finds no food. It can reproduce where the solitary skeptic boasts of being barren. In short, in religion alone was Darwin justified, for Catholicism was the spiritual survival of the fittest. From the Well and Shallows, page 82. If these 6 conversions are read without the balancing of something deeper, they have the superficial look that belongs of necessity to apologetics. Some essays in the Well and the Shallows, most of the Thing, Christendom in Dublin, and above all, the Queen of Seven Swords, give us that deeper, quieter thinking when the mind is meditating upon the great mysteries of the faith. Only very occasionally is it possible to glimpse beneath Gilbert's reserve, but such glimpses are illuminating. Father Walker, who prepared him for his first communion, writes, "It was one of the most happy duties I have ever to perform, that he was perfectly well aware of the immensity of the real presence on the morning of his first communion. It can be gathered from the fact that he was covered with perspiration when he actually received our Lord. When I was congratulating him, he said, 'I have spent the happiest hour of my life.' Yet he went but seldom to Holy Communion, and an unfinished letter to Father Walker gives the reason. The trouble with me is that I am much too frightened of that tremendous reality on the altar. I have not grown up with it, and it is too much for me. I think I am morbid, but I want to be told so by authority." And in Christendom in Dublin, he says, "The word Eucharist is but a verbal symbol. We might say a vague verbal mask for something so tremendous that the assertion and the denial of it have alike seemed a blasphemy that has shaken the world with the earthquake of 2,000 years. I have heard it said that in these later years, Gilbert's writing became obscure, and I think it is partly true, only partly, for the old clarity is still there, except when he is dealing with matters almost too deep for human speech. He wrote in The Thing, "A thinking man can think himself deeper and deeper into Catholicism. Great mysteries like the Blessed Trinity or the Blessed Sacrament are the starting point for trains of thought, stimulating, subtle, and even individual. To accept the Logos as a truth is to be in the atmosphere of the Absolute, not only with St. John the Evangelist, but with Plato and all the great mystics of the world. To exalt the Mass is to enter into a magnificent world of metaphysical ideas, illuminating all the relations of matter and mind, flesh and spirit, of the most impersonal abstractions as well as the most personal affections. Even what are called the fine doctrinal distinctions are not dull. They are like the finest operations of surgery, separating nerve from nerve but giving life. It is easy enough to flatten out everything around for miles with dynamite if our only object is to give death. But just as the physiologist is dealing with living tissues, so the theologian is dealing with living ideas, and if he draws a line between them, it is naturally a very fine line. If there appears a contradiction in the picture of Chesterton the philosopher pondering on the Logos and Chesterton the child offering trinkets to Our Lady, we may remember the eternal wisdom playing in the world, playing before God always, whose delight it is to be with the children of men. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. The Living Voice. Chesterton spoke once of the keen joy for the intellect of discovering the causes of things, but he was not greatly interested in science. He would have said that although the physical sciences did represent an advance in the grasp of truth, it was, in the words of Browning, only the very superficial truth. He desired a knowledge of causes that did not dwell simply on what was secondary, but led back to the first and final cause. To the medieval thinker, science was fascinating as philosophy's little sister. It was to philosophy what nature was to man. Nature had been to St. Francis a little lovely dancing sister. Science had been to St. Thomas the handmaid of philosophy. The modern world thought these proportions fantastic. Huxley used nature as a word for God. Physical science had ousted philosophy. An American friend lately told me of a girl who, asked if she believed in God, replied, "Sure, I believe in God, but I'm not nuts about him." Gilbert was not nuts about science. Therefore, in a world that saw nothing else to be nuts about, he was called its enemy. And as with other things taken more solemnly by most moderns, he preferred to get fun out of the inventions of the age. He wrote in a fairly early number of G.K.'s Weekly, "Eskimo Song," so that audience in Chicago will have the advantage of hearing Eskimos singing, or words to that effect. Wireless Program. Oh, who would not want such a wonderful thing as the pleasure of hearing the Eskimos sing? I wish I had Eskimos out on the lawn, or perched on the window to wake me at dawn. With Eskimos singing in every tree, oh, that would be glory for me. Oh, list to the song that the Eskimos sing, when the penguin would be, if he could, on the wing, would soar to the sun if he could, like the lark, but for most of the time it's totally dark. Or hark to the bacchanal songs that resound when they're making a night of it half the year round, and carousing for months till the morning is pale, go home with the milk of the walrus and whale. Oh, list to the sweet serenades that are hers, who, expensively gowned in most elegant furs, leans forth from the lattice delighted to know that her heart is like ice and her hand is like snow. God bless all the dear little people who roam and hail in the icebergs the hills of their home. For I might not object to be listening in if I hadn't to hear the whole program begin, and the President preach international peace, and parricides show an alarming increase, and a justice at Bootle excuse the police, and how to clean trousers when spotted with grease, and a pianist biting his wife from caprice, and an eminent Baptist's arrival at Nice, and a banker's regrettably painless decease, and the new quarantine for the plucking of geese, and a mad millionaire's unobtrusive release, and a marquis divorced by a usurer's niece. If all of these items could suddenly cease and leave me with one satisfactory thing, I really should like to hear Eskimos sing. It was hardly the expression of an attitude to science, but he did have such an attitude. Life was to him a story told by God, the people in it the characters in the story. But since the story was told by God, it was quite literally a magic story, a fairy story, a story full of wonders created by a divine will. As a child, a toy telephone rigged up by his father from the house to the end of the garden had breathed that magic quality more than the transatlantic cable could reveal it in later life. It did not need mechanical inventions to make him see life as marvelous. His overruling interest was not in mechanics, but in will. The will of God had created the laws of nature and could supersede them. The will of man could discover these laws and harness them to its purposes. God is where you find it, and the value of science depends on the will of man. A position which may not sound so absurd in the light of the harnessing of science to the purposes of destruction. When discussing machines, we sometimes tend, said Chesterton and Sidelights, to overlook the quiet and even bashful presence of the machine gun. There was an impishness in Gilbert, especially in his youth, that encouraged the idea of his enmity to science. Where he saw a long white beard, he felt like tweaking it. An inquiring nose simply asked to be pulled. It was only in comparatively sober age that he bothered in The Everlasting Man to explain, quote, "I'm not at issue in this book with sincere and genuine scholars, but with a vast and vague public opinion which has been prematurely spread from certain imperfect investigations." Unquote. The Everlasting Man, page 67. That vast and vague public opinion certainly suspected him of irreverence even towards sincere and genuine scholars. Yet it was by his use of the most marvelous of modern inventions that he won in the end the widest hearing among the public that he had ever known. It is not so many years ago that we donned earphones in a doubtful hope of being able to hear something over the radio. It is the less surprising that it was only in the last few years of his life that Gilbert became first interested in the invention, and presently one of the broadcasters most in request by the BBC. He felt about the radio as he did about most modern inventions, that they were splendid opportunities that were not being taken, or else were being taken to the harm of humanity by the wrong people. What was the use of calling all countries if you had nothing to say to them? What much modern science fails to realize, he wrote, is that there is little use in knowing without thinking. And again, writing about the amazing discoveries of the day, quote, "Nobody is taking the smallest trouble to consider who in the future will be in command of the electricity and capable of giving us the shocks. With all the shouting about the new marvels, hardly anybody utters a word or even a whisper about how they are to be prevented from turning into the old abuses. People sometimes wonder why we not infrequently refer to the old scandal covered by the word Marconi. It is precisely because all these things are really covered by that word. There could not be a shorter statement of the contradiction than in men howling that word as a discovery and hushing it up as a story." Unquote. G.K.'s Weekly, August 15, 1925. For the thing that really frightened him about the radio was its possibilities as a new instrument of tyranny. The British Broadcasting Company holds in England a monopoly and is to a considerable extent under government control. It is possible to forbid advertising programs because the costs are met by tax of 10 shillings a year, levied on the possession of a radio set. In an article called Unseen Catastrophe, January 28, 1928, Gilbert wrote, quote, "Suppose you had told some of the old Whigs, let alone Liberals, that there was an entirely new type of printing press, eclipsing all others, and that as this was to be given to the king, all printing would henceforth be government printing. They would be roaring like rebels, or even regicides. Yet that is exactly what we have done with the whole new invention of wireless. Suppose it were proposed that the king's officers should search all private houses to make sure there were no printing presses. They would be ready for a new revolution. Yet that is exactly what is proposed for the protection of the government monopoly of broadcasting. There is really no protection against propaganda, being entirely in the hands of the government. Except, indeed, the incredible empty-headedness of those who govern. On that sort of thing, at least, we are all socialists now. It is wicked to nationalize mines or railroads, but we lose no time in nationalizing tongues and talk. We might once have used, and we shall now never use, the 20th century science against the 19th century hypocrisy. It was prevented by a swift, sweeping, and intolerant state monopoly, a monster suddenly swallowing all rivals, alternatives, discussions, or delays, with one snap of its gigantic jaws. That is what I mean by saying we cannot see the monsters that overcome us. But I suppose even Jonah, when once he was swallowed, could not see the whale." End quote. In the summer of 1932, Gilbert was first asked to undertake a series of radio talks for the BBC. Everyone seems agreed that he was an extraordinary success. Letters from Broadcasting House are full of such remarks as, "You do it admirably," "Quite superb at the microphone." In one his work is called unique. Radio was now added to all his other activities during the 4 years he still had to live. Dorothy kept a diary in which she noted in 1 year the giving of as many as 40 lectures, and entered reminders of engagements of the most varying kinds all over England, from the King's Garden Party to the Aylesbury Education Committee and the Oxford Union, to Scotland for rectorial campaigns, dinners at the Inner Temple and the Philosophical Society, Detection Club dinners, and mock trials, at one of which he was defended on the charge of perversely preferring the past to the present. Besides the books discussed in the last chapter, the Dickens introductions and the collected poems were republished in 1933. Other books were planned, including one on Shakespeare. That same year, Gilbert's mother died. During her last illness, Frances was torn between London and Beaconsfield, for her own mother was dying in a nursing home at Beaconsfield, her mother-in-law at Warwick Gardens. Once I drove her between the two, and she told me how she suffered at the difficulty of giving help to two dying agnostics. She told me on that drive how she knew her mother-in-law had not liked her, but had lately made her very happy by saying she realized now that she had been the right wife for Gilbert. To a cousin, Nora Grosjean, Frances spoke too of how she and Mrs. Edward had drawn together in those last days, and she added, "No mother ever thinks any woman good enough for her son." Nora Grosjean also reports, "Aunt Marie said to me more than once, 'I always respect Frances. She kept Gilbert out of debt.'" Warwick Gardens had been their home so long that vast accumulations of papers had piled up there. Mr. Ed, too, had been a sort of keeper of the family archives. Gilbert glanced at the mass and, as I mentioned at the beginning of this book, told the dustman to carry it off. Half had already gone when Dorothy Collins arrived and saved the remainder. She piled it into her car and drove back to Beaconsfield, Gilbert keeping up a running commentary all the way on the hoarding habits of women. The money that came to Gilbert and Frances after Mrs. Edwards' death made it possible for them to plan legacies not only for friends and relatives, but also for the Catholic Church in Beaconsfield, with which they had increasingly identified their lives and their interests. Their special dream was that Top Meadow itself should be a convent, best of all, a school, and in this hope they bequeathed it to the Church. A year later, another family event, this time a joyful one, took Gilbert back to his youth. Molly Kidd, daughter of Annie Furman, became engaged to be married. She was a rather special young cousin to Gilbert, both because of the old affection for her mother and because she had played hostess to him in Canada when her mother was ill. He wrote, quote, "Postmark August 28, 1934. My dear Molly, I am afraid that chronologically, or by the clock, I am relatively late in sending you my most warm congratulations. And yet I do assure you that I write as one still thrilled and almost throbbing with good news. It would take pages to tell you all I feel about it, beginning with my first memory of your mother, when she was astonishingly like you, except that she had yellow plaits of hair down her back. I do not absolutely insist that you should now imitate her in this, but you would not be far wrong if you imitate her in anything, and so on, till we come to the superb rhetorical passage about you and the right fulfillment of youth. It would take pages, and that is why the pages are never written. We bad correspondents, we vile non-writers of letters, have a sort of secret excuse that no one will ever listen to till the day of judgment, when all infinite patience will have to listen to so much. It is often because we think so much about our friends that we do not write to them. The letters would be too long, especially in the case of wretched writing men like me, who feel in their spare time that writing is lonesome and thinking about their friends pleasant. In the course of turning out about 10 articles on Hitler, on humanism, on determinism, on distributism, on Dollfuss and Darwin, and the devil knows what, there really are thoughts about real people that cross my mind suddenly and make me really happy in a real way. And one of them is the news of your engagement. Please believe me, dear Molly, that I am writing the truth, though I am a journalist, and give my congratulations to everyone involved. Yours with love, G.K. Chesterton." Unquote. And in that year came 2 bits of public recognition of rather different kinds. He was elected to the Athenian Club under Rule 2, honoris causa, and he and Belloc were given by the Pope the title of Knight Commander of St. Gregory with Star. During these years the paper had gone steadily on at some considerable inconvenience, because, he said, he still felt it had a part to play. At home and abroad the scene had been steadily darkening. In July 1930, 3 years before Hitler came to chancellorship, we find the following among the notes of the week. Quote, "When we are told that the ancient Marshal Hindenburg is now dictator of Germany, we suspect a note of exaggeration. Hindenburg never was the dictator of anything, and never will be. He is, however, the man who keeps the seat warm for a dictator to come. Hindenburg has led us back to Frederick the Great. Hindenburg has now given rein to the extreme nationalists. with the delivered provinces to support him in the flush of patriotism, and the extreme nationalists have only one policy, to reconstitute the unjust frontiers of Germany, which Europe fought to amend." Unquote. In 1931 had come the customs union between Germany and Austria, the obvious impotence of the League of Nations to restrain Japan, the national government, and falling sterling in England. Less than 2 years later, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, and in 1934 came the murder of Dollfuss. Chesterton wrote of the tragedy whereby the name Germany was taken from Austria and given to Prussia. With Dollfuss fell all that was left of the Holy Roman Empire. The barbarians had invaded the center of our civilization, and like the Turks besieging Vienna, had struck at its heart. He regarded Hitler merely as the tool of Prussianism. The new paganism was the logical outcome of the old Prussianism. It was, too, the apotheosis of tyranny. Quote, "In the pagan state, in antiquity or modernity, you cannot appeal from tyranny to God, because the tyranny is the God." Unquote. Belloc solemnly warned our country that we were making inevitable the death and great pain of innumerable young Englishmen, now boys. It may be in 2 years, or in 5, or in 10, the blow will fall. November 8, 1934. Yet even this seemed less terrible to Chesterton than the state of mind then prevailing, the mood, nay, the fever of pacifism that demanded the isolation of England from Europe's peril. He called it mafficking for peace, a sort of imperialism that forgot that the Atlantic is wider than the Straits of Dover, and allowed Lord Beaverbrook to regard England as part of Canada. Englishmen who have felt that fever will one day look back on it with shame. "This most noble and generous nation," he wrote with a note of agony, "which lost its religion in the 17th century, has lost its morals in the 20th." The League of Nations had, G.K. held, been thought at first to be a kind of Pentecost, but had in reality come together to rebuild the Tower of Babel, and this because it had no common basis in religion. Quote, "Humanitarianism does not unite humanity, for even one isolated man is half divine." Unquote. But today man had despaired of man. Quote, "Hope for the Superman is another name for despair of man." Unquote. Reading a recent commentary in a review, I suddenly saw that politics and economics were not what mattered most in the paper. The commentary in question was to the effect that G.K.'s weekly was inferior to the New Witness because G.K. had only general principles and ideas and no detailed inside knowledge of how the world of finance and politics was going. Looking again through the articles I had marked as the most characteristically his, I saw that they were not only chiefly about ideas and principles, but also that they were mostly pure poetry. Chesterton was, I believe, greatest and most permanently effective when he was moved, not by a passing irritation with the things that pass, but by the great emotions evoked by the eternal, emotions which in eternity alone will find full fruition. There are in the paper articles in which, appearing to speak out of his own knowledge, he is merely repeating information given him by Belloc. And it was quite out of Chesterton's character to write with certainty about what he did not know with certainty. Hence, this writing is his weakest. But the paper has, too, some of his strongest work, and his mind as he drew to the end of life lingered on thoughts that had haunted him in its beginning. Quote, "Before the Boer War had introduced me to politics, or worse still to politicians," he wrote in a Christmas article in 1934, "I had some vague and groping ideas of my own about a general view or vision of existence. It was a long time before I had anything worth calling a religion. What I had was not even sufficiently coherent to be called a philosophy. But it was, in a sense, a view of life. I had it in the beginning, and I am more and more coming back to it in the end. My original and almost mystical conviction of the miracle of all existence and the essential excitement of all experience." Unquote. December 6, 1934. This he felt must be the profound philosophy by which distributism should succeed, and whereby he tested the modern world and found it wanting. Quote, "Something of which Christmas is the best traditional symbol. It was then no more than a notion about the point at which extremes meet, and the most common thing becomes a cosmic and mystical thing. I did not want so much to alter the place and use of things as to weight them with a new dimension, to deepen them by going down to the potential nothing. to lift them to affinity by measuring from zero. The most logical form of this is in thanks to a Creator. But at every stage I felt that such praises could never rise too high, because they could not even reach the height of our own thanks for unthinkable existence, or horror of more unthinkable non-existence. And the commonest things, as much as the most complex, could thus leap up like fountains of praise. We shall need a sort of distributive psychology as well as a distributive philosophy. That is partly why I am not content with plausible solutions about credit or corporative rule. We need a new, or old, theory and practice of pleasure. The vulgar school of panem et circenses only gives people circuses. It does not even tell them how to enjoy circuses. But we have not merely to tell them how to enjoy circuses. We have to tell them how to enjoy enjoyment." Unquote. December 13, 1934. In attacking a special abuse, Chesterton was most successful when he took the thought to a deeper depth. The following Christmas 1935 he wrote, quote, "We live in a terrible time of war and rumor of war. International idealism, in its effort to hold the world together, is admittedly weakened and often disappointed. I should say simply that it does not go deep enough. If we really wish to make vivid the horrors of destruction and mere disciplined murder, we must see them more simply as attacks on the hearth and the human family, and feel about Hitler as men felt about Herod." Unquote. The modern world tended to gild pure gold, and then tried to scrape the gilt off with gingerbread, to paint the lily and then complain of its gaudiness. Thus it had vulgarized Christmas, and now demanded the abolition of Christmas because it was vulgar. It was the truth he had emphasized years ago in contrast with Shaw. The world had spoilt the ideas, but it was the Christian ideas the world needed, if only in order to recover the human ideas. He went on, quote, "If we want to talk about poverty, we must talk about it as the hunger of a human being. We must first say of the beggar, not that there is insufficient housing accommodation, but that he has not where to lay his head. We must talk of the human family in language as plain and practical and positive as that in which the mystics used to talk of the Holy Family. We must learn again to use the naked words that describe a natural thing. Then we shall draw on the driving force of many thousand years and call up a real humanitarianism out of the depths of humanity." Unquote. I should like to collect all the essays and poems on Christmas. He wrote several every year, yet each is different, each goes to the heart of his thought. As Christopher Morley says, quote, "One of the simple greatnesses of G.K.C. shows in this, that we think of him instinctively toward Christmas time." Unquote. Mark Twain, Quarterly, Spring, 1937. Some men, it may be, are best moved to reform by hate, but Chesterton was best moved by love, and nowhere does that love shine more clearly than in all he wrote about Christmas. It will be for this philosophy, this charity, this poetry, that men will turn over the pages of G.K.'s Weekly a century hence if the world still lasts. It is for us who are his followers to see that they are truly creative. Destruction of evil is a great work, but if it leaves only a vacuum, nature abhors that vacuum. Creation is what matters for the future, and Chesterton's writing is creative. So, too, with the radio. In this new medium his mind was alert to present his new old ideas, his fundamental philosophy of life, after some fresh fashion. A letter from the Broadcasting House, November 2nd, 1932, after his first talk, records the delight of all who heard it. Quote, "The building rings with your praises. I knew I was not alone in my delight over your first talk. I think even you in your modesty will find some pleasure in hearing what widespread interest there is in what you are doing. You bring us something very rare to the microphone. I am most anxious that you should be with us till after Christmas. You will have a vast public by Christmas, and it is good that they should hear you. Would you undertake 6 further fortnightly talks from January 16th onwards?" Unquote. He was asked to submit a manuscript, but promised he should not be kept to the letter of it. Quote, "We should like you to make variations as these occur to you as you speak at the microphone. Only so can the talk have a real show of spontaneity about it." Unquote. "You will forgive me," one official writes, "if I insist on speaking to you personally. That is how I think of our relations." G.K. was unique, and they told him so. A lot of reading was necessary for these talks, each one dealing with from 4 to 10 books, and also a principle of selection. The principle Gilbert chose for one series was historical. Quote, "Literature lives by history, otherwise it exists, like trigonometry." Unquote. In the 5th talk of the autumn series of 1934, he gives a general idea of what he has been attempting. Quote, "This is the hardest job I have had in all these wireless talks, and I confront you in a spirit of hatred because of the toils I have endured on your behalf. But after all, what are my sufferings compared to yours? Incredible as it may seem to anybody who has heard these talks, they had originally a certain consistent plan. I dealt first with the heroic and half-legendary stories, touched upon medieval chivalry, then on the party heroes of Elizabethan or Puritan times, then on the 18th century, and then the 19th. In this address I had meant to face the 20th century, but I find it almost faceless, largely featureless, and anyhow very bewildering. I had meant to take books typical of the 20th century as a book on steel is typical of the 18th, or a book on Rossetti of the 19th, and I have collected a number of most interesting 20th century books, claiming to declare a 20th century philosophy. They really have a common quality, but I rather hesitate to define it. Suppose I said that the main mark of the 20th century in ethics, as in economics, is bankruptcy. I fear you might think I was a little hostile in my criticism. Suppose I said that all these books are marked by a brilliant futility. You might almost fancy that I was not entirely friendly to them. You would be mistaken. All of them are good. Some of them are very good indeed. But the question does recur, what is the good of being good in that way? Mr. Geoffrey West's curious post-war credo has one commandment. He does say, he does shout, we might say, he does yell that there must be no war. But he cannot impose his view because authority is gone. And he cannot prove his view because reason has gone. So again it all comes back to taste. And I have enjoyed the banquet of these excellent books, but it leaves a bad taste in my mouth." Unquote. The peculiar half-official, half-private direction of Broadcasting House is based on a theory of strict impartiality towards all opinions and an attempt simply to give the public the programs that the public wants. Whether it is possible to maintain such a position is another question. That this is the theory there is no doubt, and one result is an abiding uncertainty of mind in most of the officials. Broadcasting House hangs suspended in the air of public opinion, and that fickle breath leaves them in no security as to any of their artists. The resulting sensitiveness became soothed as the months passed on, and they got as near to trusting Chesterton as they ever come with anyone. True, letters came attacking him, but far more enthusiastically approving of him, and the attacks he answered often by private letters that turned the critic into a friend. Some of his suggestions were not acceptable. He was warned off or proposed humorous talk about Dean Inge and Bishop Barnes in a series called Speeches That Never Happened. Subject too serious. Avoid religion. But he was later asked to talk in a series on freedom as Catholic and also to debate with Bertrand Russell on who should bring up our children. In this debate he was especially brilliant, says Maurice Baring, and another friend wrote, quote, "I have just been listening not without joy to your putting it across Mr. Bertrand Russell." Afterthought. What a mincer! It struck me very much, having read much of his writing with interest. It just shows that the spoken word still has something that the written one can't convey. Is there a mincing mind of which a mincing voice is the outward and visible warning? Unquote. It was interesting that the last few years of Gilbert's life should have furnished this unique opportunity of contact through the spoken word between him and the English people. His voice on the radio had none of the defects that marred it in the hall. His material was far better arranged, his delivery perfect. He seemed to be there beside the listener, talking in amity and exchanging confidences. The morning after his death, Edward MacDonald passed a barber shop off Chancery Lane. The man was lathering a customer's face, but recognizing Mr. MacDonald, left the customer and ran out, brush in hand. "I just want to say I was sorry to hear the news," he said. "He was a grand man." Mr. MacDonald asked him if he knew Chesterton well. "Never read a word he wrote," the barber answered, "but I always listened to him on the wireless. He seemed to be sitting beside me in the room." "That man," Edward MacDonald comments, "emphasized what I still think, that G.K.C. in another year or so would have become the dominating voice from Broadcasting House." In 1934 Gilbert had jaundice, and on his recovery he started with Frances and Dorothy on one of those trips that were his greatest pleasure. They went to Rome, it was Holy Year, and thence to Sicily, intending to go on to Palestine. At Syracuse, however, Gilbert became really ill with inflammation of the nerves of the neck and shoulders. They stayed 5 weeks in Syracuse, gave up the trip to Palestine, and returned home by Malta. Gilbert and Frances were to have dined at Admiralty House, but he was too unwell to dine out, and only came up one afternoon. Lady Fisher remembers going to see them at the Osborne Hotel. Gilbert was sitting on a rickety basket chair, obviously in pain, and talking a good deal in order to hide it. She sympathized with him for the cold weather, his obvious physical misery, and the discomfort of his chair. "You must never sympathize with me," Gilbert answered, "for I can always turn every chair into a story." The next year they motored in France and Italy, and Gilbert records in the Autobiography an experience in a French café when he felt a rare thrill, not in talking on the radio, but in listening, on a day that, quote, "was dateless, even for my dateless life, for I had forgotten time and had no notion of anything anywhere. When in a small French town I strolled into a café noisy with French talk. Wireless songs wailed unnoted, which is not surprising, for French talk is much better than wireless. And then unaccountably I heard a voice speaking in English, and a voice I had heard before, for I heard the words, 'Wherever you are, my dear people, whether in this country or beyond the sea.' And I remembered monarchy and an ancient cry, for it was the king, and that was how I kept the Jubilee." Unquote. After he got home, I remember how delightedly Gilbert quoted the captions on 2 banners hung in the heart of the London slums. One read, "Down with Capitalism, God save the King." The other read, "Lousy but loyal." He knew that it was true, and it served to increase the passionate quality of his pity. Patient he could be for himself, but the lot of the poor aroused in him a terrible anger, and in a broadcast on liberty he gave that anger vent. For worse than the presence of lice in our slums was the absence of liberty. He would gladly, he said, have spoken merely as an Englishman, but he had been asked to speak as a Catholic, and therefore, quote, "I am going to point out that Catholicism created English liberty, and that the freedom has remained exactly in so far as the faith has remained, and that where it is true that all our faith has gone, all our freedom is going. If I do this, I cannot ask most of you to agree with me. If I had anything else, I could not ask for any of you to respect me." Unquote. Other speakers in the series had dwelt on the liberties secured to Englishmen by our parliamentary and juridical system, both, he noted, of Catholic origin. But in his eyes, even that liberty was being imperiled today where it was not lost, while the most important freedom of all, freedom to handle oneself and one's daily life, had disappeared for the mass of people. The liberty so widely praised that followed the Reformation, quote, "has been a limited liberty because it was only a literary liberty. You always talked about verbal liberty. You hardly ever talked about vital liberty. The faddist was free to preach his fads, but the free man was no longer free to protect his freedom. Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, responsible forms of rule, have collapsed under plutocracy, which is responsible rule. And this has come upon us because we departed from the old morality in 3 essential points. First, we supported notions against normal customs. Second, we made the state top-heavy with a new and secretive tyranny of wealth. And third, we forgot that there is no faith in freedom without faith in free will. A servile fatalism dogs the creed of materialism, because nothing, as Dante said, less than the generosity of God could give to man, after all ordinary orderly gifts, the noblest of all things, which is liberty." Unquote. The thoughts that had thronged and pressed on him for half a century found final expression in these broadcasts, most of all in 2 talks, one given only 3 months before his death in a series entitled The Spice of Life, the other 2 years earlier in one called 7 days hard. He was haunted by the ingratitude of humanity. As in his boyhood, he saw the wonder of the world that God has given to the children of men, and he saw them unconscious of that wonder. What did a week mean for most of them? 7 full days. What did it really mean? What has really happened during the last 7 days and nights? 7 times we have been dissolved into darkness as we shall be dissolved into dust. Our very selves, so far as we know, have been wiped out of the world of living things. And 7 times we have been raised alive like Lazarus, and found all our limbs and senses unaltered with the coming of the day." Unquote. 7 days of human life. The meaning of the phrase, the spice of life, both brought the same running motif. Quote, "A great many people are at this moment paying rather too much attention to the spice of life, and rather too little attention to life." Unquote. Not in any, quote, "distraction from life is the secret we are all seeking, the secret of enjoying life. I am perfectly certain that all our world will end in despair unless there is some way of making the mind itself, the ordinary thoughts we have at ordinary times, more healthy and more happy than they seem to be just now, to judge by most modern novels and poems." Unquote. A week had never been for Chesterton just 7 days hard, although he had worked hard enough. He had enjoyed the spice of life. He had liked beer and skittles and the distractions of life and its high points of achievement. Quote, "But it is much more important to remember that I have been intensely and imaginatively happy in the queerest because the quietest places. I have been filled with life from within a cold waiting room, in a deserted railway junction. I have been completely alive sitting on an iron seat under an ugly lamp post at a third-rate watering place. In short, I have experienced the mere excitement of existence in places that would commonly be called as dull as ditch water." And by the way, is ditch water dull? Naturalists with microscopes have told me that it teems with quiet fun. Unquote. The younger generation were despairing of life in the face of life's manifold gifts. Chesterton, as a youth, had revolted against the pessimism of his elders. Now he revolted as an old man against a young generation corroded by a yet more poisonous pessimism. "The Hollow Men," T.S. Eliot had called the poem, and in it came the lines, "This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper." Quote, "Forgive me if I say in my old world fashion that I am damned if I ever felt like that. I knew that the world was perishable and would end, but I did not think it would end with a whimper, but, if anything, with a trump of doom. I will even be so indecently frivolous as to burst into song and say to the young pessimists, 'Some sneer, some snigger, some simper, in the youth where we laughed and sang, and they may end with a whimper, but we will end with a bang.'" Unquote. His last message for this generation was the sound of a trumpet calling us to resurrection. A dead world must find life again, must go back to the meaning of the book of Genesis at which he had learnt to sneer, must realize a week once more with, quote, "the grandeur of that conception by which a week has become a wonderful and mystical thing in which man imitates God in his labor and in his rest." Unquote. Through this call sounds a note of most solemn warning, quote, "Unless we can bring men back to enjoying the daily life which moderns call a dull life, our whole civilization will be in ruins in about 15 years. Whenever anybody proposes anything really practical to solve the economic evil today, the answer always is that the solution would not work, because the modern town populations would think life dull. That is because they are entirely unacquainted with life. They know nothing but distractions from life, dreams which may be found in the cinema, that is, brief oblivions of life. Unless we can make daybreak and daily bread and the creative secrets of labor interesting in themselves, there will fall on our civilization a fatigue which is the one disease from which civilizations do not recover. So died the great pagan civilization, of bread and circuses and forgetfulness of the household gods." Unquote. The Listener, January 31st, 1934. This splendid world that God has given us, and the furniture of it is, as the writer of Genesis saw it in his vision, has in it the material happiness of labor. and in the true end of labor. Quote, "For the true end of all creation is completion, and the true end of all completion is contemplation." Unquote. End of chapter 36.
Chapter 32 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. Last Days. Dorothy told me one day in 1935 that Gilbert had written the beginning of an autobiography some years before, but had laid it aside. She had, she said, a superstitious feeling about urging him to get on with it, as though the survey of his life and the end of his life would somehow be tied together. I urged her to get over this feeling because of all the book would mean to the world. After this talk she got out the manuscript and laid it on Gilbert's desk. He read what he had written and immediately set about dictating the rest of the book. Early in 1936 he told a group of friends that the book was finished. One of them said, "Nunc dimittis," and Edward MacDonald, who was present, commented, "The words were chilling, though he seemed to be in fairly good health, but certainly he was tired." The book showed no sign of fatigue. High-spirited and intensely amusing, it seemed to promise many more, for into almost old age he had carried the imagination and energy in which, as a very young man, we saw his resemblance to the youthful Dickens. Reviewing his life with the thread of Thanksgiving that had been his clue throughout, he looked back on it as indefensibly happy, and it was in truth a rich and full human existence. Yet Father Vincent, who knew him intimately, speaks of him in these last years as heartbroken by public events, as suffering with the pains of creation. He was crucified to his thought. Like St. Thomas, he was never away from his thought. A fellow friar had to care for Thomas, to feed him sicut nutris, because of his absorption in his thought. Thus Father Vincent saw Francis cherishing Gilbert both mind and body. A friend, protesting vehemently against the phrase "crucified to his thought," says it was his lifelong beatitude to observe and ponder and conclude. Of his own so-called paradoxes, Gilbert was wont to maintain that it was God, not he, who made them, and here we have surely one of the paradoxes of human life: intense vitality, joy in living, vigor of creative thought, brought to their owners immense happiness and acute suffering. Is it not a part of the most fundamental of all antinomies, the greatness and the littleness of man? Created for eternity and prisoned in time, we have no perfect joy in this world, and the reaching upward and outward of the mind is at once the keenest joy and the fiercest pain, rather as we talk of growing pains. Only Gilbert loved to grow so much that he would not think of the pain. "You must never pity me," he said to Lady Fisher, and all through his life he was saying and meaning, "You must never pity me." But while he was writing the autobiography and giving thanks for his life, his last months were shadowed by trials, especially heavy for a man of his imagination and temperament. For now more than ever his thought was not allowed to concentrate on those realities where the joy of contemplation overpowers the pain of growth. He loved Italy, even more than France, he says in one letter. Yet he could not but condemn the invasion of Abyssinia. The shadow of the Spanish War loomed on the horizon, and behind it a darker shadow. In his political thinking, Chesterton was haunted by the present war. Then, too, while public controversy did not trouble him at all, he hated any breach of the peace within the ranks of his own small army. The fights among the staff of the paper about distributism had been nothing as compared with those about Abyssinia. Their leading articles taking one line, and letters in the cockpit in violent opposition. Morris Reckitt writes in As It Happened, In the last autumn of his life I wrote to him privately in distress at the line which the weekly was taking on Abyssinia, and saying that I felt that I ought to leave the board, as I was so much out of sympathy with this. I received this reply, from which I have deleted only some personal references. Top Meadow, Beaconsfield, 19th September 1935. My dear Mr. Morris Reckitt, I do hope you will forgive me for the delay in answering your most important letter, involving as it does tragic dooms of separation which I hope need not be fulfilled. I should like to ask you to defer your decision at least until you have seen the next week's number of the paper, in which I expand further the argument I have used in the current number, and bring it, I think, rather nearer to your natural and justifiable point of view. Between ourselves, and without prejudice to anybody, I do think myself that there ought to have been a more definite condemnation of the attack on Abyssinia. The whole thing happened while I was having a holiday. Very shortly, the moral danger to me is the rehabilitation of capitalism, in spite of the slump, which will certainly take the form of a hypocritical patriotism and glorification of England, at the expense of Italy or anybody else. For the moment I only want you to understand that this is the mountainous peril that towers in my own mind. Yours always, G.K. Chesterton. 3 months later, in G.K.'s Weekly, he wrote about the whole matter in an article in which he treated the question as largely one of proportion. Not enough was being said in England of her own or the League's position about Japan's attack on China, too much in proportion about Italy and Abyssinia. If the League of Nations really were an impartial judicial authority, and if, what is about as probable, I were one of the judges, and if the Abyssinian case were brought before me, I should decide instantly against Italy. I have again and again in this place stated in the strongest words the particular case against Italy. It was against Italy and Abyssinia as he had been against England and South Africa. But I should not be bound to rejoice at the Prussians riding into Paris, because it might prevent the British riding into Pretoria. Tragic dooms of separation on public issues were not the only trouble with G.K.'s Weekly. The staff were also engaged in violent personal quarrels about which Gilbert was asked to take sides, was even bitterly reproached by one for supposedly favoring another. It would be hard today to say what it was all about, but 2 of the contestants have told me since that had they had the least notion how ill he was getting, they would have died rather than so distress him, for it was a real and very deep distress. It may be remembered that Miss Dunham noted how Gilbert used to make a mysterious sign in the air as he lit his cigar. That sign, says Dorothy, was the sign of the cross. Long ago he had written of human life as something not gray and drab, but shot through with strong and even violent colors that took the patterns of the cross. He saw the cross signed by God on the trees as their branches spread to right and left. He saw it signed by man as he shaped a paling or a doorpost. The habit grew upon him of making it constantly, in the air with his match, as he lit his cigar, over a cup of coffee. As he entered a room he would make on the door the sign of our redemption. No, we must never pity him, even when his life was pressed upon by that sign which stands for joy through pain. Those nearest to him grew anxious quite early in 1936. He was overtired and working with the weary insistence that over-fatigue can bring. The remedy so often successful of a trip to the Continent was tried. They went to Lord's and Lisle, and he seemed better and sang a good deal in his tuneless voice as Dorothy drove them through the lanes of France. From Lisle he wrote a penciled letter, long and almost illegible under the shadow of the shrine, trying to reconcile the disputants with himself and with one another. The summer was cold and bleak, and the tour was all too short. Home again, his mind seemed not to grip as well as usual, and he began to fall asleep during his long hours of work. The doctor was called and thought very seriously of the state of his heart, that heart which many years ago another doctor had called too small for his enormous frame. The thought of a Chesterton whose heart was too small presents a paradox in its own best manner. To Edward MacDonald, who had missed a message that he was too ill to be visited, Gilbert talked in his old fashion and promised a poem he had just thought of for the paper, on St. Martin of Tours. The point is that he was a true distributionist. He gave half his cloak to the beggar. Soon after this he fell into a sort of reverie, from which awakening he said, "The issue is now quite clear. It is between light and darkness, and everyone must choose his side." Francis and he had both thought his recovery in 1916 was a miracle. "I dare not," said Francis, "to pray for another miracle." Monsignor Smith anointed him, and then Father Vincent arrived, in response to a message from Francis which he thought meant she wanted him to see Gilbert for the last time. Taken to the sick room, he sang over the dying man the Salve Regina. This hymn to Our Lady is sung in the Dominican order over every dying friar, and it was surely fitting for the biographer of St. Thomas and the ardent suppliant of Our Lady. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo, et spes nostra salve, et Jesum benedictum fructum ventris tu nobis post hoc exilium ostende. Gilbert's pen lay on the table beside his bed, and Father Vincent picked it up and kissed it. It was June 14th, 1936, the Sunday within the octave of Corpus Christi, the same feast as his reception into the church 14 years earlier. The introit for that day's Mass was printed on his memorial card, so that, as Father Ignatius Rice noted with a smile, even his memorial card had a joke about his size. "The Lord became my protector, and he brought me forth into a large place. He saved me because he was well pleased with me. I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my firmament, and my refuge, and my deliverer." To these words from the Mass, Francis added Walter de la Mare's tribute. "Night of the Holy Ghost, he goes his way. Wisdom his motley, truth his loving jest. The mills of Satan keep his lance in play. Pity and innocence his heart at rest." The day of the funeral was one of blazing sunshine. "One of your days," Gilbert would have said to Francis. Gray days were his, when nature's colors, he said, were brightest against her more somber background. Sunny days were hers, for she loved a blue, blazing sky. The little church near the railway was filled to overflowing by his friends from London, from all over England, from France even, and from America. All Beaconsfield wanted to honor him, so the funeral procession, instead of taking the direct route, passed through the old town where he had so often sat in the barber chair and chatted with his fellow citizens. At Topmeadow we gathered to talk. Frances, a few of us saw for a little while in her own room. With that utter self-forgetfulness that was hers, she said to her sister-in-law, "It was so much worse for you. You had Cecil for such a short time." Later, Monsignor Knox preached in Westminster Cathedral to a crowd far vaster. Both Francis and Cardinal Hinsley received telegrams from Cardinal Pacelli, now Pope Pius XII. To Cardinal Hinsley he cabled, "Holy Father, deeply grieved death, Mr. Gilbert Keith Chesterton, devoted son, Holy Church, gifted defender of the Catholic faith. His Holiness offers paternal sympathy, people of England, assures prayers, dear departed, bestows apostolic benediction." This telegram was read to the vast crowd in the cathedral, and found an echo in the hearts of his fellow countrymen. Hugh Kingsmill wrote to Cyril Clemens, "My friend Hesketh Pearson was staying with me when I read of Chesterton's death. I told him of it through the bathroom door, and he sent up a hollow groan which must have echoed that morning all over England. It was reason that the Pope offered his sympathy not to Catholics alone, but to all the people of England. To the policeman who said at the funeral, "We'd all have been there if we could have got off duty." It was a grand man. To the man at the Times office who broke in on the announcement of his death, "Good God, that isn't our Chesterton, is it?" The barber who had to leave his customer unshaved that he might talk to Edward MacDonald. To all of us, his friends, on whom the loss lay almost unbearably heavy. To those for whom his presence would have pierced and lightened even the dark shadow of the war. To all the people of England. Once more a pope had bestowed upon an Englishman the title Defender of the Faith. The first man to receive it had been Henry VIII, and the words are still engraved on the coins of England. The secular press would not print the telegram in full because it bestowed upon a subject a royal title. After Gilbert's death, Frances tried to take up life again. She visited her cousins in Germany, a university professor and his English wife who were undergoing the persecution of the swastika. She was deeply moved by their suffering and the peril they stood in. Home again, she surrounded herself more than ever with children, taking a catechism class and encouraging her small scholars to come to Top Meadow, where her garden also helped her toward a difficult peace and serenity, rendered harder by the struggle with ill health. Soon we began to realize that the physical weakness, which all her courage could not overcome, was more than merely her old malady. "What did Frances die of?" Bernard Shaw wrote to me. "Was it of widowhood?" In fact, it was a most painful cancer, heroically endured. She was cared for by Dorothy, and presently by the nuns of the Bon Secours. Her friends visit her as they were allowed. Father Vincent McNabb, after a talk of almost an hour, noted how never once did she speak of herself or of her suffering. Her concerns were for Dorothy, for the Church, and for Gilbert's memory. Eric Gill's monument, the biography, the permanence of his own writing. She survived him little more than 2 years. Near the end, from the face of a dying woman shrunken with pain, we could still see those great heavenly eyes that seemed to make the truth at the heart of things almost too terribly simple and naked for the sons of flesh. End of chapter 32. Last Days.
Chapter 46 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. Appendix A. An Earlier Chesterton. Both the Autobiography and Prison Life of George Laval Chesterton are worth reading. There is conscious humor. We feel it might be our own Chesterton when we hear the captain describing himself as laughing immoderately, because he had made a fool of himself and others were laughing at him. There is unconscious humor, especially in the astonishing style full of such phrases as, "I was the most obnoxious to peril," or "something not far removed from impunity stalked abroad." Captain Chesterton started life as a soldier. During the Peninsular War his regiment was stationed at Cartagena. It was a subject of deep mortification to most of us to be thus supinely occupied in this lone garrison, thereby being debarred from the Peninsular medal, and hence a widespread disaffection on that most tender subject which no reasoning has been equal to dispel. However, later he saw a good deal of active service, being in the War of 1812, in the course of which the Battle of Bladensburg was fought and Washington fell to the British arms. "The astonished slaves," he says, describing the advance on Washington, "rested from their work in the fields contiguous, and the awestruck peasants and yeomen of this portion of America beheld with perturbation the tremendous preparations to devastate their blooming country." To the smaller professional armies of that day peace was a misfortune, and in his quaint style Captain Chesterton describes the demonstrations of joy on the part of himself and his fellow officers at the escape of Napoleon from Elba, foreseeing, as he frankly observes, a scope for further adventure and hope of personal advancement. This hope was short-lived, and we next see him fighting in the British Legion of a rebel South American army against Spain. The general mismanagement of this expedition, and the fact that the Republicans killed all their prisoners, was a death-blow to all my past enthusiasm in the Republican cause. Many British officers, participating with me in the detestation for cold-blooded butchery, conspired from that moment to elude this detested service. Mark ye who delight in transcendent liberalism, the cruel exigencies of such a warfare. In his acceptance of transcendent liberalism, yet his determination to see truly what passed before his eyes, and when needful to change his standpoint, this earlier Chesterton was much like the later. He had not the genius of Gilbert, he could not see so far, but he shared his refusal to be blinded by custom, theory, or even patriotism. In his accounts of army life, he had commented fearlessly on the cruelty of the punishments, and described his fellow officers as made ill by seeing a private receive 500 lashes. He had noted corruption in the train service, which was consequently divested of its genuine claim to honor. Feted by the planters of Jamaica, he had yet spoken with horror of their slave ownership. Now he was appointed governor of a prison in England, and here began the great work of his life in a frontal attack on the corruptions he discovered. The yardsmen did a secret traffic in all the goods forbidden in the prison. There were caches of tobacco, spirits, and such things under the pavements. The weaker prisoners were robbed by the stronger. The women's and men's quarters were so arranged that by connivance of the jailers frequent meetings took place. On one of these occasions Captain Chesterton himself appeared. My hands were seized with tender impressment, and I was addressed as "my love," "my darling," "my dear creature," and all the conventional endearments of the pave were showered upon me. I had to struggle for enlargement, and beat a hasty retreat, quite confounded by my situation, into prison discipline. And the consternation occasioned by this discovery became perfectly electric. Attempts to bribe him were followed by attempts to kill him, but he stood firm. Mrs. Fry invoked his aid to improve the home conditions to which the prisoners had to return. Chesterton turned to Dickens, and to Dickens' friend, Miss Coutts, in defiance of a narrow-minded magistrate, who perversely insisted, as was by cynical interpretation literally too true, that Miss Coutts had no right to confer with prisoners within those walls, nor was it to be tolerated that Mr. Charles Dickens should walk into the prison whenever he pleased. From Coldbath Fields the reforms begun by Captain Chesterton and warmly seconded by Dickens spread to other prisons. Although, he declares, I consented to forego pecuniary advantage, I cling the more tenaciously to the credit of my past exertions. When beset with fraud, ferocity, and moral pollution, I achieved a triumph fraught with civilizing influences. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. Appendix B. Prize Poem written at St. Paul's. This is the only version I have been able to find. Across the top is written in another hand, "This is not exactly the same as given in the prize poem." The difference is probably slight. St. Francis Xavier, the Apostle of the Indies. He left his dust by all the myriad tread of yon dense millions trampled to the strand, or 'neath some cross forgotten lays his head, where dark seas whiten on a lonely land. He left his work, what all his life had planned, a waning flame to flicker and to fall. 'Mid the huge myths his toil could scarce withstand, and the light died in temple and in hall, and the old twilight sank and settled over all. He left his name, a murmur in the east, that dies to silence amid older creeds, with which he strove in vain, the fiery priest of faith less fitted to their ruder needs, as some lone pilgrim with his staff and beads, mid forest brutes whom ignorance makes tame, he dwelt and sowed in Eastern Church's seeds. He reigned a teacher and a priest of fame. He died, and dying left a murmur and a name. He died, and she, the Church that bade him go, yon dim enchantress with her mystic claim, has ringed his forehead with her aerial glow, and monkish myths, and all the whispered fame of miracle, has clung about his name. So Rome has said, but we, what answer we, who in grim Indian gods and rites of shame, o'er all the East the teacher's failure see, his Eastern Church a dream, his toil a vanity? This then we say, as time's dark face at last moveth its lips of thunder to decree the doom that grew through all the murmuring past to be the canon of the times to be. No child of truth, or priest of progress he, yet not the less a hero of his wars, striving to quench the light he could not see. And God, who knoweth all that makes and mars, judges his soul unseen, which throbs among the stars. God only knows, man failing in his choice, how far apparent failure may succeed. God only knows what echo of his voice lives in the cant of many a fallen creed. God only gives the laborer his meed, for all the lingering influence widely spread, broad branching into many a word and deed. When dim oblivion veils the fountainhead, so lives and lingers on the spirit of the dead. This then we say, let all things further rest, and this brave life, with many thousands more, be gathered up in the Eternal's breast. In that dim past his love is bending o'er, healing all shattered hopes and failures sore, since he had bravely looked on death and pain, for what he chose to worship and adore, cast boldly down his life for loss or gain, in the eternal lottery, not to be in vain. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Gilbert Keith Chesterton by Maisie Ward. Appendix C. The Chestertons. The composition of the Chestertons is not without interest for the student of legendary literature. By a curious paradox, the book had to be strikingly untrue to be accepted as true, since the jokes about sisters-in-law are legion, so that mere commonplace shafts of what is called feminine spite would have gained little credence. Yet, on the other hand, Mrs. Cecil Chesterton was able, to quote the Mikado, to get from her husband a good deal of corroborative detail designed to give verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. Of these details some are true, some false, all arranged to support the main untruth of Francis and Gilbert's relation to one another. The thesis of the book is that Gilbert was an unhappy and frustrated man, A, because Francis shrank from consummating their marriage, and B, because she dragged him away from his London life and friends to bury him in a middle-class suburb. I confess that I am Victorian enough heartily to dislike writing this appendix. Yet it is necessary, for many who read the Chestertons have supposed that a story told by so near a connection must be true. The ground was laid for the introduction of the legend by the tale of the red-haired phantom, if I may describe it in terms of a ghost story. That ghost was easy to lay. See introduction. Next comes the old account of Gilbert and Frances' honeymoon, and of the years that followed. It is, of course, possible that the first night of their marriage was not happy, especially in the Victorian days of reticence, which left wife and even possibly husband unprepared for life together, though this did not normally prevent a happy marriage and a pack of children afterwards. But I find it impossible to imagine Cecil Chesterton, like the bridesmaid on the honeymoon, receiving and passing on such a story as that of Gilbert, quivering with self-reproach, so that after the first night he dared not even contemplate a repetition. Gilbert, young and vital, was condemned to a pseudo-monastic life in which he lived with a woman, but never enjoyed one. There is a psychological reason for thinking this story especially improbable, and a physical reason for dismissing it as actually impossible. A white horse had from his childhood been for Gilbert the supreme sign of romance, and he had chosen to spend the first night of his honeymoon at the White Horse Inn. From his honeymoon he wrote home that he had a wife, a piece of string, a pencil, and a knife. What more can any man want? 10 years later he wrote the Ballad of the White Horse, and dedicated it to Frances, saying, "O go you onward where you are, shall honour and laughter be, past purple forest and pearled foam, God's winged pavilion free to roam, your face that is a wandering home, a flying home for me." And over 30 years later he wrote again of beginning his honeymoon under the shadow of the White Horse, and compared it to a trip to fairyland. Can any human being read the record of this recurrent motif and reconcile it with Mrs. Cecil's picture? Let me refer again to the Ballad of the White Horse. Is it conceivable that any man should write after 10 years of frustration and unhappiness? Up through an empty house of stars, being what heart you are, up the inhuman steeps of space, as on a staircase go in grace, carrying the firelight on your face, beyond the loneliest star. This is not the way a man writes to a neurotic, cold-hearted woman who has made a hermit of him. Mrs. Cecil was, of course, never in the intimacy of the family. She only married Cecil in 1917, by which date Gilbert and Frances had been married 16 years, and before that she was merely an acquaintance. But Frances's intimates could have told her how absurd her story was, for by a rare good fortune the operation Frances underwent to enable her to bear children is itself evidence one could hardly have hoped for in a matter which civilized people are not much given to discussing. Frances talked of the operation to Monsignor O'Connor, to Dorothy Collins, and to Annie Furman, and I have quoted the doctor's letter about it. See above chapter 15. It was an abiding tragedy for both husband and wife that it was unsuccessful. Frances would have shrunk from no suffering in her passionate wish for a child. There is another curiosity in the legend. Gilbert, despite this story, was apparently perfectly happy in London during the first 8 years of marriage. It was only after the removal to Beaconsfield, and in almost middle life, that he began to be frustrated. Poor Frances! What a picture of her had been proposed for posterity! So powerful she could waft Gilbert away from London and from his friends, could force him to make her his banker, and reduce him to a bounty strictly limited to ½ crown. Yet so powerless that she had to sign the cheques for G.K.'s Weekly, much as she hated it. Her poetry, described as quite charming, is spoken of as appearing in little parish magazines, the only papers she cared to read, owing to her implacable hatred for Fleet Street. It is hard to picture Frances with an implacable hatred for anything, and it will be remembered that she actually begged Father O'Connor to leave Gilbert to be a jolly journalist. The periodicals in which her poems appeared were the Observer, the Sunday Times, the Daily Chronicle, the Westminster Gazette, and the New Witness. Personally, I have never much admired Frances's verse, but a professional journalist might have been quite pleased at making all these papers. Not one poem ever appeared in a parish magazine, so far as either Dorothy or I have been able to ascertain. The point is not a very important one, but the sneer is symptomatic. A curious magic pervades the Chestertons. Succulent sausages appear in the kitchen at Overstrand Mansions, and flow in torrents of beer, so that Gilbert can steal away from an unsympathetic wife to consume them with his Fleet Street friends. A studio materializes in a meadow at Beaconsfield. Can we imagine Gilbert cooking, or even ordering sausages, getting beer to the flat, designing or discovering the studio. Anyone thinking about what really happened would realize that Frances ordered the beer and sausages. Frances built the studio. But that is not the sort of thought we are to think about Frances. About her we are told that she always wore the wrong colors, that she gave Gilbert insufficient and indigestible food, that she did not know what work meant, that Mrs. Belloc thought Gilbert ought to beat her, that she kept the journalists away when Gilbert was dying. In point of fact, both telephone and doorbell were so near the sick room that the use of both had to be avoided, that she did not give her guests enough to eat at his funeral, that she actually sought the quiet of her own room instead of staying downstairs to receive condolences when her husband's coffin had just been lowered into the grave. With all this spate of detail, we are not told that Frances left £1,000 to Mrs. Cecil, plus £500 for her Cecil houses. Even if I could have ignored the attack on Frances, I should be obliged, as his biographer, to deal with the attack on Gilbert, more subtly but no less certainly made. The story of the marriage affects Gilbert as much as Frances, and the book culminates in the final assertion that his drinking killed him. Here are the comments sent to me by Dorothy of the doctor who attended Gilbert and Frances from 1919 until they died. Today Dr. Bakewell came in and answered the questions about the book which we asked him. 1. He says that the idea that G.K. was better when drinking in Fleet Street because the stimulus of conversation would eat up effects of the alcohol is absolute nonsense. It would have just as bad an effect under any conditions. Dr. Bakewell said that G.K. was his patient for nearly 20 years, and that during that time he never treated him for alcoholism or saw any trace of it, though in an absent-minded way he was always liable to drink too much of anything if it were there, even water. Without the understanding, loving, tactful care of Frances, he would have died 20 years before, certainly if he had racketed around Fleet Street any longer. Dr. Bakewell said Gilbert was perfectly happy in Beaconsfield, and not in any way frustrated. There was no frustration of any kind, and no longing for London life or friends. He was very intimate with Gilbert, and would have known if there had been. 2. The doctor says that Gilbert died of a failing heart owing to fatty degeneration leading to dropsy. 3. Frances had arthritis of the spine, not curvature as stated by Mrs. Cecil. The doctor said that he put him on the water wagon several times, and when this was done Gilbert observed the rule most meticulously. Dr. Bakewell said that he did not do it very often, because he did not consider that drink was in any way affecting Gilbert's health during the greater part of the time he knew him. In a later conversation he added that when he did forbid alcohol at certain periods, it was simply to make liquid less attractive, as too much of even water was bad for Gilbert. The statement made by Mrs. Cecil that drinking in London was not so serious because the talk and excitement among friends would carry off the effects is thought by doctors almost comic. Dr. Bakewell denies it absolutely. Dr. Pocock, who, it will be remembered, attended Gilbert during his illness of 1914-15, says, "Absolute nonsense. Would probably have been worse in London." He adds also, "I cannot understand why such an attack was made upon G.K. From my personal observation, he owed a very great deal to Mrs. G.K., who greatly helped his restoration to health." One can get one's pen'orth of fun out of the chapter on the exile of Beaconsfield, when one remembers the true story of those years. Rome, Jerusalem, USA, Poland, France, Spain, Malta, lectures all over England, lively contests for the Lord Rectorship of 3 universities, London again and again, for editing, mock trials, debates, and distributus beanos, and frequently in furnished flats which Frances would take for the winter months. One can only suppose that Mrs. Cecil was so little intimate with them that she did not realize all this. And then Beaconsfield itself, parties in the studio, people down from London, visitors from Poland, France, America, Italy, Holland, and other countries, the Eric Gills, the Bernard Shaws, the Emil Cammerts, and others living in the neighborhood, The guest room was always occupied by some intimate. Meanwhile, the books poured out of the little study. Mrs. Cecil thinks Gilbert hardly ever wrote again a masterpiece after leaving Battersea. Yet in support of this idea she lists as masterpieces The Ball and the Cross, written at Beaconsfield; Lepanto, written at Beaconsfield; Magic, written at Beaconsfield; Stevenson, written at Beaconsfield; and The Ballad of the White Horse, mainly written at Beaconsfield. Of all the books she mentions in this connection, only 3 were written in London, and she admits that the world at large did not share her view of the sterilizing effect of Beaconsfield, for she writes, "Meanwhile his fame grew wider, his sales greater. In exile he ruled a literary world." Gilbert left to Mrs. Cecil Chesterton sums equal to those later left to her by Francis, £1,000 for herself and £500 for Cecil houses. The ingratitude that omitted all mention of these benefactions struck the imagination of several of the Chesterton family as the worst feature in the book. But to Gilbert and Francis the giving of money, even in their own lifetime, was a slight matter. They had given something far greater. Why was the memory of Cecil Chesterton alive today? Because of his brother's labors. Why is it possible for Mrs. Cecil to declare that he was the greater editor, to imply that he was the greater man? Because Gilbert kept saying so. Never has such devotion been shown by one brother to the memory of another. Never has the greater man exalted the lesser to such a pedestal. We are told in the Chestertons that Frances sacrificed both Gilbert and herself on the altar of her family. Truly there was much self-sacrifice in the lives of both to family, friends, and causes. They did not feel it as self-sacrifice to enrich the lives of others, even at cost to themselves. But the heaviest cost they paid lay in the years of a toll that was literally killing Gilbert, while Frances watched him growing old too soon and straining his heart with work crushingly heavy. And if there was a single altar for that supreme sacrifice, it was no other than the altar of Cecil's memory. End of chapter 48. End of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, by Maisie Ward.